Okay, so let's get this started. Let's just see, is the audio working here? Okay, it is. So I can switch to this. So, yes, here we are, Azula discussion stream. So, yeah, like I said from the title, we've got a main Azula character discussion stuff here. And a specific sort of comic discussions document. But first, I suppose there is a little bit of other news to talk about. There's not too much, obviously. Avatar Generations is now out. Everyone's got a chance to play that. But also the kind of somewhat well spread, somewhat not talked about whole, Echoes and Aftershocks kind of title kind of reveal that sort of came out, and the whole situation surrounding that is kind of interesting because, everything points to that being a movie title, and there's only one officially announced Avatar movie, so that title has to be associated with it. But interestingly, it seems like that's been taken down. A person on LinkedIn actually changed it to Avatar Untitled, so Echoes and Aftershocks has been removed, obviously since it spread around a little bit. So obviously we weren't meant to know about that, but, is it the actual full announcement? I don't even know. And that's obviously a bit of a weird one to talk about, just because that could easily be a working title, but we're still not meant to know that that's the case. Echoes and Aftershocks, is it too general? Does it actually work? Who knows? But there's not too much to say about it, really. Same pretty much goes for, I think, Avatar Generations. I think a lot of people are just waiting for kind of like new stuff to get added to that. I did a video just recently on some of the new characters in the game, which I do think are interesting, by themselves. But we're waiting for the bigger stuff ultimately. So yeah, definitely reads as a placeholder name for the movie. Yeah, probably, because it comes across as very much like that is a sequel title, but is it like specific enough? In that ultimately for like the Avatar the first movie, all they really need to say is like Avatar the Last Airbender the movie, and like it's as simple as that. Like that probably does everything you need to do, but they probably want to have some sort of a fitting title. So that's really all there is. Otherwise, we're just kind of waiting for stuff. Though I suppose this announcement here with the Spirit Temple kind of full-on reveal, release date, and the description stuff was actually somewhat interesting. I think Echoes and Aftershocks means Lao Ge. Maybe. But anyway, we are here fundamentally to discuss Azula. So, we'll get to the Spirit Temple stuff later. I think that the thing here is that I think we need to have the discussion just about Azula as a character, where her arc is up until us heading into the Spirit Temple, so we can properly discuss, the situation here. Just because every time Azula kind of comes up as a character, it can often, get bogged down in kind of like specific kind of things. So I think it's important to have the full-on character arc discussion for her to get to that point. So, Azula. Let's start with the idea of redemption, I suppose, because this is ultimately what we're talking about here. It's directly mentioned in the Spirit Temple description. They are now talking about this in the marketing for this book. Azula and redemption are very much now tied together from the people making the book. They're wanting you as the audience to think about Azula in the context of, will she have a redemption or will she not have a redemption? So it's no longer just fan speculation or interpretation of previous comics. They're teasing this book as, will it happen or not? So it often gets bogged down in sort of like, do you want Azula to have a redemption? And then it's very strict yes or no. But the whole point of this is that it's a nuanced thing. So the dictionary definition of the term redemption is the actions of saving or being saved from sin, error, or evil. Note how it's not a character who has a full 180 character arc and joins the hero group, which I think is what a lot of people read redemption in Avatar as. So in the context more of media, it means a character changing to move away from their kind of like villainous ways or attempting to make amends for previous bad actions. There's nuance here, as in like, it's not just villain to hero. A hero can redeem themselves for an error or a mistake. That's Aang's arc, you could say, especially post, it's his arc post running away, but it's also his arc post book 2 and the failure at Ba Sing Se. A villain can change into like an anti-hero, and there's many other scenarios in between. So the main point for like Azula is a redemption arc does not always mean a full character 180, because I see it a lot. A lot of people think that with Azula, the word redemption comes up, and that they would that they're going to do the full Zuko turnaround. Azula will become the new Team Avatar member, when I think most people who want to see some growth from Azula basically to say, yes, I want a redemption arc. It's just an arc where she comes out of it as someone who is not always the villain, which is different than she's now a hero. And that's the kind of point here of we want this nuanced kind of growth for the character where she can still have that kind of cruel edge, because you don't want to just completely change the character and she doesn't resemble the character we've known all this time up until this point. But a character who can be that way, but also realizes it's not the only way to interact with people. So an Azula who can still control a room with her like commanding charisma, but one who can be less intense around those she's actually close to. The idea, for me, why I do lean in the direction of like it has to be some form of redemption arc, is that Azula is clearly not meant to be Ozai 2.0, even if they're so super similar. That a lot of aspects of her come from Ozai. We know she does care about other people. That's the really important thing for Azula. Why you have to view her as having hope versus Ozai. Of course, there's no real hope for him to ever really change, but there is for Azula. This is why her friends and family going against her damaged her so badly. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail. Ozai, as we know, doesn't care about anyone but himself. But Azula does care. There's no hope for him. And then it's just the sense, like, it feels wrong to think that there's no hope for someone as young as Azula, especially given what we've been presented with overall. And that's the thing here. The idea is that what we want is a Azula character arc. And I don't think it's wrong to frame it as redemption. I think people just have to realize that redemption is a broad topic. Zuko has a specific redemption arc. Darth Vader has a specific redemption arc, which is the redemption in death arc. But there's gulfs between them. Aang has a bit of a redemption arc. Even in Avatar. Note that when Zuko returns to the Fire Nation at the start of Season 3, Ozai, when he speaks to Zuko, is just like, "You have redeemed yourself, my son." So, to Ozai, Zuko defeating the Avatar and, you know, making amends for speaking out of turn is a redemption. Let's see. What do we have in chat here? Yes, I do think the Azula redemption arc probably is somewhat similar to the one that Kuvira has in Runes of the Empire. Obviously different because like Azula is a different character. Let's see, Azula barely cares about others. She tried to kill Zuko multiple times and smiled when Ozai burned Zuko, and she said burn the Earth Kingdom to the ground. And it's like, yeah, but then it's like, Iroh also joked about burning places to the ground as well. Zuko tried to kill our hero characters multiple times as well. Nuance is what we're about here. That, yes, Azula obviously has more villainous acts to her name than, say, Zuko does. But that's the point here. That's in a way why she can't have the full redemption arc, but she can still have something. And then, you know, she barely cares about others. No, she does care. Like, otherwise, why does she break down so much when Mai and Ty Lee leave? It's because deep down, that friendship, or at least her control over people she thought was her friends, was something that mattered to her. Similarly, we know how her mother feels about her is something that means a lot to her as well. That's why it gets brought up. That's why Azula brings it up herself. So a lot of that stuff is pretty interesting. So again, like, this is stuff I have kind of written out because I think it's important to get these in place so we avoid situations where we're having discussions here and we still have people being like, no, Azula's just a villain. Why are we having this discussion? Azula's just a villain and should be that way. When, in my mind, the arc feels clear enough that something is happening with her. I don't think there's any other way to read The Search, read Smoke and Shadow, and not see that something is happening with the character. That's why they're teasing it in Azula in the Spirit Temple, is because we're going to do something with the character here. And I'd be very surprised if it's a double down on she's always the villain. That's why she is an interesting character. And I think, you know, if the argument is that we need villains and she's the only villain that we have, then that speaks to the fact that we need to write other villains so that Azula doesn't have to occupy that position, you know, at all times and stuff like that. So, you know, there's that sort of stuff. So then we get into sort of the idea of, like, do you have sympathy for the character? Like, I think this is the other angle on it, of, like, once you get past the idea of, like, what redemption actually means, you discuss basically, do you actually, like, feel sympathy for Azula as a character? And, like, are we meant to because of what happened? Obviously, my answers are yes and yes. I think you are meant to. And I do feel sympathy for Azula. But that doesn't mean, like, you know, full sympathy. Again, it's nuance, you know, while still acknowledging that the character always has the choice to do the better thing. But she is the villain and hasn't had the epiphany yet, hasn't had the change yet. But you can see the potential in her. And it's that sort of idea. You have sympathy to kind of feel that, you know, she can change as well. And obviously a lot of it's like this. When you get to this scene, I find it difficult to not feel something for the character, in that I don't just interpret that as, like, Azula being upset that she lost, but rather, like, the fact that she lost makes her break down so much like that, in combination with everything that's come before. The Ursa hallucinations, what that all means, this coming after, you know, people she cares about have left her, she's banished everyone around her, and in this moment is kind of truly alone because she's been defeated here. Shortly after this, Ozai is defeated, like, her whole side loses, and, like, her entire world kind of changes in after this scene. And I think that the important thing here is, again, if we are sympathetic to, like, Zuko or other characters who have had a redemption arc and we like their character arcs, then it feels like, to be reasonable, you also have to be sympathetic to Azula as well. Because part of why we're sympathetic to Zuko is because of how, like, Ozai impacted his life, how he was raised, his past. And that's the point. Like, Azula is part of that family as well. Azula is also affected by Ozai. Now, there's a bit of a discussion about to what extent, which is obviously something that is definitely worth getting into. And you can make the argument that in some ways, and probably it is the right way to view it, Azula is more impacted by Ozai. That, you know, like I say here, Zuko faced the kind of wrath of Ozai, his anger for not being good enough, but was otherwise kind of, like, ignored for the most part, and then, of course, banished. So Zuko spent a couple of years away from Ozai, just dealing with the fact, in a way, that his father did banish him, and Zuko kind of grew to want that, of course. we weren't sympathetic for Zuko. He just changed so quick before we could realize that. I don't know if I agree with that. Um, um, yeah, there's a lot of moments where you feel sympathy for Zuko. Like you get it in episode 3, then it's developed upon in the storm, and so on, and it goes on onwards. So yeah, Ozai couldn't influence Zuko as much as he did Azula, kind of like directly raising her to be his, tool for power and conquest. He doesn't truly care about her, just how skilled of an asset that she is. That's the kind of whole kind of thing here, is that this is the way Azula was impacted by the main villain of the show. That those years when Zuko was banished, Azula was right there, I suppose, effectively being crafted into effectively the character that we know. And you can have some sympathy to that as well. And yeah, that's a good point there, that Ozai had an effect on Zuko. Zuko just had someone like Iroh to guide him. And that's the point, is that throughout the series, Azula has so far not had anyone like Iroh to really help her or guide her. And I think the setup is, I think, either some combination of her mother, Zuko probably filling in for the Iroh role in this case, or something like that, maybe even Ki. It's those type of characters, I think, helping Azula make the big change in the same way that Iroh helped Zuko make his big change. And that's the kind of point as well, is that, there's so much to talk about. Like, the next point here is a longer one. Again, the whole document here, I wrote a lot initially and then realized that, like, do you know what? I should probably save some of this to just discuss on screen. So I saved myself from writing like a 10,000 word article on Azula here to do this. But yeah. So the beach is another thing. And again, we're talking about sympathy for Azula as a character here. The beach is where I think you see the idea that, like, in a way, just like as a person, here is what Azula lacks. And it's clear how, like, very focused down specific paths Azula and the way she was raised was, and how there's really normal things that she just has no clue about. And the beach shows that, like, it's probably one of the only real times you see it from her, where Azula just decides that, hey, I want to try and act normal here, and you can see how it doesn't work. She has no clue how to interact with people when she's not trying to control them with fear or manipulation. Now, this is obviously going to be, for me, a very key point in terms of, like, what Azula will need to do to change as a character. And we've seen this brought up a lot. This is referenced in the show. It's referenced in basically all of the comics. Her control of people through fear is her kind of like trademark tactic. And this is her, in a way, greatest asset, but also like her greatest weakness, because it hurts her when it breaks. So, her jealousy of Ty Lee is actually a quite interesting thing. Like, she's jealous effectively of how people are naturally drawn to Ty Lee. That's somewhat telling, that this is basically the interaction that, like, Azula can never really have, because she always does it her way, and it's unnatural in a way for her to do it in the normal way. And so she has to learn from Ty Lee, this is how you do it. And it's a very kind of fun scene, but there's also a big thing of just like, oh yeah, because she just has no real concept of this ultimately. Like, even Zuko, who's relatively awkward in that episode, is still acting as like a somewhat like a specific type of teenager in a way within that episode, even though he has his own kind of issues. But also, like, this does show you a bit of glimmer of hope for the character, that there is a bit of a want to be more than just the controlling. That if she was lost, I think, as a character, why would she want to do that? And I think just the whole idea that on Ember Island, the place that's meant to kind of smooth you out, she actually does seek to truly be more of a kind of normal teenager, is interesting. That, she does have somewhat of an interest in romance, even if in that scene, of course, she ruins it immediately by she's effectively formed some sort of a relationship with Chan, and then immediately is like, we'll be a power couple and rule and dominate the earth and stuff like that. And that's the problem, is that she acts as one way and then it changes back to normal Azula when you get to the kind of the big point. So, I think to some degree it's this. Now, there's a case to be made that maybe this is just also what the core character of Azula is, even without the influence of Ozai, but that's a bit of another discussion which we will get to. And it's a hint of, is this what Azula with her armor off actually is? That, like Zuko, Azula's a pretty awkward character at heart. And I think this is what Arnie has when he did his tweet thread a bunch of years ago about, in the writer's room, what theoretically the arc for Azula kind of would have been, what a redemption for Azula would have been. Now, I think in his one, it's cool, and then the idea of what Azula, I think, in his thread tweet would have been was a little bit kind of weird, but I think you want aspects maybe of that at the end, and I think that's kind of what you want at the end, just that she can have normal interactions with characters, and in this episode we saw a little bit of that, and that's what we kind of, I think, want, that when needed she can dominate, but when asked to be normal she's socially pretty bad or something like that. So there's that as well. Then we get into the relationship with Ursa. This is obviously the key thing, and there's discussion to kind of be had here about all this, and the whole idea of there's a separate discussion about is Ursa a bad mother? I personally don't think so. And again, we're discussing Azula here, so the idea is, as presented, Azula's behavior as a child was bad. Now, how did Ursa handle that? But I don't know, it's some of those situations were relatively kind of extreme, I think, on the Azula side of things, that you'd be somewhat worried about her with regards to not really showing a lot of compassion for hearing about the death of Lu Ten, the way she taunts Zuko after she hears about the Azulon punishment of Ozai, and dad's going to kill you type thing. That's a bit of a kind of problem here. So you do get lots of scenes of Ursa scolding Azula, but given the character, and I think the way Ozai kind of raises her, it almost feels like this is kind of important for Azula, that she had someone who was no, you should not be like this. And this might be those glimmers from her mother might be the kind of things that really kind of maybe help her in the end. And again, Azula has come to believe that this means her mother kind of thought she was a monster. And Ursa, rightfully so as a mother, must have been concerned at this, but she did care about Azula. And this is why I think we get the idea that when Azula hallucinates her mother, she hallucinates her mother saying that, Ursa, saying, I love you. So it's this weird thing where, deep down, Azula knows it's true, but in a way, wants it to almost be true that her mother said she was a monster at some point. And there's a lot to analyze here about, is Azula sort of speaking for her mother actually how Azula feels about herself? So there's that whole thing. And it's a very interesting kind of topic here about when this happens. Obviously this is when her kind of mental situation begins to break down, after the betrayal of Mai and Ty Lee, and also I suppose Zuko leaving as well to a certain extent, and a few other little things happening. But just the idea that the thing that we know from, again, the beach, we know Azula cares about how her mother thinks about her, but then she does hallucinate this, but she says this. Azula says this, as she thought it was a monster, and so on. It's it's very, very interesting ultimately. And so yeah, this brings up the question, is being somewhat cruel something that mostly comes from Ozai and his focus on Azula, or is it actually a core part of her personality? In the sense that, like, if Azula has an arc and comes out of it on the good end of things, and changes as a character, is the kind of cruelty part like gone, or is that just part of who she is? Because the way a kind of Ursa almost talks about it is that, like, this is just sort of like who she is kind of growing into. Probably doesn't help that Ozai is kind of amplifying this, but that might just be the way things are working out. Again, how much does this particularly matter going forward? I'm not really sure. It's just, again, an interesting thing to actually kind of talk about here. A lot of discussion in the chat about the whole Azula is the Bonte tribe character from Beginnings. I don't think it's the case. Like, I think it's a cool theory that has lasted for quite a while, but I feel they would have mentioned it if it was the case. So, like, I won't be really bringing that up. Now, who knows? Like, maybe Azula the Spirit Temple will lead her down somewhat of a spiritual path and stuff like that. But it's a speculation. Yeah. So there's that. So all this highlights is that, of course, Ursa and Azula will need to talk at some point. It's been probably one of the most heavily teased things in almost like all of Avatar at this point. So that needs to happen. So there's that. Back to Ursa. Yeah, how did Ursa's banishment impact, like, Azula? We know we had the scene from the comics. I think I have it down here, actually. Yeah, we had this scene confirming, like, what we didn't get to see in the episodes, of course, but that she did also say goodbye to Azula. It's just that Azula didn't wake up. So there's that important moment that happened as well. Azula is unaware that this happened. So if there's this kind of thing where, like, Azula really cares about her mother, and then just waking up one day and her mother's gone, and in a way Azula can see that it's affecting maybe Zuko initially more than her, but it had to have impacted her in some way for the Azula that we get in the show to ultimately have all these feelings about how, like, oh, my mother thought it was a monster, and not particularly know how it kind of works. So there's that. And then, yeah, the whole, like, in the search, finding Ursa again, discovering that she forgot them with the whole spirit stuff that happened in that comic, and now has a new family. And then the big plot point here, that Ursa also has a new daughter. Like, Ki is there. It's a really, really key scene. But also, the idea, like, it seems like that, like, initially, just from the way Azula reacts to it, there's some level of, like, jealousy there that, like, basically, you've replaced me. But then, like, when Azula's, like, around Ki in the comics, there's never really much of an opinion from Azula really given on Ki, and stuff like that. So there's that. And then, yeah, the key point, like, she runs away before she meets Ursa. Like, I think, again, I have that down here just to show this off a little bit. Yeah, like, you have some of these moments here. Like, tell me, mother, did you have to have a new daughter because your last one turned out to be such a monster? And again, we have to assume Ursa never said that to Azula. It's just her view on potentially how Ursa kind of thinks about her. And then you get this big moment. Again, this is when Ursa is Noriko and doesn't actually remember Azula. But if I really am your mother, then I'm sorry I didn't love you enough. And this hits Azula. Like, you can see the emotion there. And the idea that, again, this is a character who doesn't care. Well, there we go. Like, there's proof enough that, like, she can't quite deal with this necessarily. And of course we get into the whole kind of like Zuko dynamic here. But then she does run away. Like, right as, like, this is just before we get the sort of return of Ursa's memories and stuff like that, and Azula runs away. And again, we'll talk about this whole thing about like even when you're strong, you're weak and stuff like that. But that is what happens. And then yeah, we have the Kumurikage stuff happening at that point. But it's very, very interesting. It's a conversation that absolutely needs to happen. And we know that like Ursa, I think, is at the point where she wants it to happen. There's little moments in the comics where she is thinking about her, and that's how it works. It's all on sort of Azula, and how do you get Azula into a position where she is going to talk to Ursa, and stuff like that. What's going on here? Discussion about Azula's fire being blue. Like, there's a bunch of different reasons for it. Like, there's the art reason, which is just that they wanted hers to visually look different. Then there's just the sort of physics reason that, like, you know, blue fire implies it's hotter, and that implies like more control from Azula because she's such a talented bender. But like, it's never like within the body of the show and like, you know, full on high levels of canon super addressed what is the case. But obviously there's some reasoning there behind it, because Azula's fire isn't blue when she's younger, but it is after that point. I've always just viewed it as Azula is a character who focuses on control a lot in her bending, and so that is what kind of fuels it quite a bit. So, you know, the reality is, like, we don't have like a super, you know, amazing answer necessarily. Beyond that, yeah, like it makes sense. Yeah, you know, a prodigal character like her can make something a little bit different happen with her fire. There's that. So that's the whole Ursa stuff. And look, obviously, in terms of Azula and the Spirit Temple, I don't think this conversation is going to happen at that point. Like, I don't think there's any way you can get those characters in the same scene as each other at that point. But going into the future, I think it just needs to happen. Like, it's going to be weird if it doesn't happen. That's the kind of point that we're at. So then we get around to like, okay, so how does Azula actually go to change? Like, what are the issues that she needs to deal with that will actually prompt some level of growth to actually happen from the character? And for me, the big one is obviously this. She needs to change this. Her approach always being control through fear or manipulation. And look, as I say here, like, it's effective in many situations, especially with Azula's skill set, but we see what happens when it fails, which is like a key point. The issue seems to be that she can't bring herself to trust people on true loyalty or friendship alone. This is why, you know, she has that quote about, you know, in her view, kind of like trust is for fools, basically. And when combined with the fact that this is how she does things, that's, I think, pretty telling. And it's probably like, that's exactly how, like, I suppose Ozai would view people ultimately. And that probably comes through to her as well. So this is where, like, this feels like it is something that can be changed for the character. Like, this doesn't feel like if you change this, you fundamentally change the character to where it's someone different. She can still utilize control, but it's not the only thing that the character has. And then, yeah, so she has to threaten people and manipulate them because she views fear as being so strong it will never be broken. And so that's where you get the whole idea of Mei's betrayal in The Boiling Rock being so effective. That love, of all things, has beaten her unbreakable approach. And that this prompted, like, Ty Lee to then also kind of betray her. And this time, I suppose, more out of Ty Lee's friendship for Mei, also going past any fear or connection there was between those two and Azula herself. And even in the comics, you know, she gets to the point where she's willing to accept she's not meant to be on the throne. But she still doubles down on Zuko, who is meant to be on the throne. She accepts that. Having to do things following her own approach. So it's very much a case of like in Smoke and Shadow. It's one step forward, two steps back. And I think I have the pages down here. So yeah. See, my destiny is to make you into the Fire Lord I tried to be. One who's strong, one who rules through fear. Which is Azula's approach. So it's this weird thing where like, okay, she still views this as being this like essential thing. And that's the problem. And that's my interpretation throughout all of this scene. She is trying to change Zuko. But this is a very, very developed Zuko. Right at the end of his arc. And she thinks he's vulnerable to change. And doesn't realize that actually this is the problem. This is the problem for her. Is that she doesn't yet realize that this isn't going to work. And she thinks that like, oh, look what I did so far. And look what I'll be. I'll be Fire Lord again, kind of like through you. And she's like, it's who you are. And then Zuko, obviously, at the end of this book, gives his speech. And you don't really know how Azula necessarily views what he gave. But the idea is that he doubled down on, I want to be a better Fire Lord in the way I want to be, not the way Azula wants to be. And then referencing a little bit of the description here. You know, but after a failed attack. So the implication here seems to be that there's maybe quite a few of these failed attacks. That like ultimately Smoke and Shadow, the events of that didn't fully work out. And you have to assume that there's been other failures as well. And it's just this idea that for Azula, a character who's not used to failure, more and more of these are adding up. More and more of these situations where like her approach isn't working is beginning to add up. And when is finally going to be the moment where she realizes that like, I can't do this going forward? Like that's the really big thing. Is like, when will she finally realize that this approach is not the only way to do things? And at least to me, like the problem that you have here is that the implication is almost that, well, if Azula is meant to be right in that scene, then that means Zuko has to have a whole other section of arc. Whereas I really do feel Zuko has, for the most part, finished his character arc so far, minus maybe a couple of smaller little bits and pieces that more or less relate to like his interactions with Azula more than anything. But it is Azula who is the one who needs to change. So yeah, there's some references here to Azula from the RPG. So I'll just bring that up here while we're here. So the big one is obviously from her main point here. You know, Azula may very well care for the welfare of her brother. Though their relationship remains tenuous, Azula still has the remaining fire warriors at her disposal. But she could choose to strike out on her own instead. Chances are she isn't far from Zuko, and she is unlikely to be willingly taken alive. So, you know, that's interesting. But obviously, I assume this was written pre-knowledge of particularly what happens in the Spirit Temple comic. And there is other references as well as we go forward. You know, the Fire Warriors get mentioned here. The numbers reduced, and Azula not necessarily standing by the group she founded. The Fire Warriors are wantonly reckless with their plans. So that feels like something Azula won't like a lot of the time. So it's suggesting a feud within the group, of course. And there is some other stuff as well. Yeah, I think it's more like fire. Yeah, this one. Now, this is weird canonically. The adventure hooks, do you treat these as actually being canonical events that happened, or literally just sort of non-canon suggestions of ideas that theoretically could happen? It's very weird, but one of them obviously is this one, the assassination, and it's an assassination attempt on Iso, a high-ranking military official who supported Zuko's rise to power, and it's being executed by the Fire Warriors as a means to incite a riot. Now, is this the failure that happens like at the start of Azula in the Spirit Temple? It very well could be. It'd be a really cool connection if it was, because that would confirm to us that these adventure hooks are meant to be viewed as being canon. But I'm assuming it'll probably be something different. But at the very least, it highlights just that the role-playing game has, up until the release of this comic, the newest information about like Azula, full stop, and this is what it's like suggesting basically. But the other point with Azula is this: her skewed view on what strength and weakness actually are. And again, the reason I bring this one up, just in case maybe you're not familiar with this one, is again, it's some of the stuff mentioned here. It's this line: even when you're strong, you're weak. And why is she saying this? Because I want to help you. That's why she calls him weak. And a lot of this is like effectively this kind of like what happens in the comic of like, she's almost effectively like, if you were strong, you would take me out in this moment because I'm trying to basically get you off the throne in this comic. And the fact that you haven't done that and in fact want to help me, that makes you weak. And it's the same as we go into this stuff going forward. It's this: she wants a Fire Lord, someone who rules the Fire Nation, who is strong, who rules through fear, but also she emphasizes strong, and she emphasizes ruthlessness and stuff like that, and all of this stuff. It's just the idea of she views Zuko as being weak, when you can argue, technically, is it not like Azula who's actually like the weaker one, given some of the events that we've seen? So I think I cover some of that here. Yeah, she seems unable to see the strength that comes from, like, in a way, like allowing yourself to be vulnerable. The kind of the growth that like Zuko has basically had as a character, to be able to be like the Fire Lord, the optimistic Fire Lord, who can sort of allow himself to sort of in a way show weakness as a leader, because in a way the Fire Nation kind of has to do that, you know, has to show strength in a different way in this era, making amends for everything that's happened. You know, she views Zuko as being weak for not doing things like Ozai or Azula would, but Zuko's grown to get to this point, and it's a different form of like strength, one that like Azula, of course, doesn't understand. In that, like, from this perspective, you know, he has many reasons to hate his sister, but still chooses to try with her, to be better with her, even if anyone would maybe understand him not putting that effort in. And I think this is an interesting one. Azula, I feel, thinks that she's strong, and either is unaware or lying to herself about her own weaknesses. And I think that's what a lot of those kind of hallucinations, I think, point to. Is definitely something along those lines. Is that part of why she's having these things where I think my mother called me a monster, thinks I'm a monster, but then has proper like visions of her mother saying that she loves her, and all these other kind of more nice leaning things, is maybe sort of pointing to the idea of Azula kind of lying to herself, and just that there is these innate weaknesses that kind of she probably should attempt to address. And, you know, when it comes down to it, I think something along this line is kind of what the angle that they need to lean in the direction of. That Azula just needs to, like, open up emotionally to someone else. Which, as we see, like I think, like, which one is it here? Yes, this one. You can see that this is, like, on the verge of happening. Like, it's really, really close to happening. But she runs away before she gets a chance to talk it out. And she obviously, when she regains her composure and puts the sort of like armor of control back on when in Smoke and Shadow, she of course basically locks herself off from having any true like emotional connections with anyone in Smoke and Shadow. So this is why it's very important, like, for the upcoming comic to, I think, do stuff to just like open that up again, have Azula tackle sort of like her emotions about things, to get to the kind of core of who she is. And yeah, that's the point there, like mentioned by Lauren in chat there. She has to learn how to be like a true friend to people by caring about them and not controlling them. Because I suppose like that's a question here. I'll mention it here with both of these. But was there ever a true, like, this is an interesting question, because if Azula has always been somewhat controlling from a young age, which I think they even sort of allude to in the little flashback they talk about where they stayed over at Mai's, that Azula was always a little bit of a kind of troublemaker like this, but did it lean when they were younger really hard in the direction of like she's controlling them through fear to be friends. I get the impression that there is a true friendship with both of these characters. I do think that is the case. I definitely think that there is something there, but I don't like, and you sort of wonder, is the moment where this maybe changed? Was it maybe coinciding with the banishment of Ursa, that was what directed it in one way over the other, and so on. It's interesting because it's weird because I do think the relationship she has with Mai and Ty Lee is different, in that I think in some ways, like, I think Ty Lee, I get the impression, was almost like was closer to Azula, like, because as we see, like, Ty Lee really looks up to Azula. She views Azula as someone to kind of follow. Whereas I think Mai is more kind of relaxed, of like, there was a friendship there, but also Mai is the first one to kind of go against her, and it's more like Ty Lee that follows when Mai is put at risk. So there's that stuff. Okay, the cookbook gets brought up. Okay, the whole cookbook thing is really weird, because the book implies a lot, but I think you can just as easily be like, this has to be a mistake. There's no way they let this get through, that this is a scene set into the future where this is what happens. Like, it's I would view it just as, it's a low level of canon that I think snuck through right at that kind of time when Avatar Studios was just about on the verge of happening. And, how closely was the person they were working with at Nickelodeon Paramount looking at those cookbook, like, flavor text kind of pieces? Because again, as far as I'm aware, it was the writer of that cookbook did all the work on the actual food items and writing the flavor text that was just like passed through, like, with the people that she was working with. So I really get the impression that, like, that never touched the hands of any particularly notable writer on the show or anything like that. And that stuff in those books like that can slip through. Now, maybe it is a tease into the future that this is what happened, but I feel it's a little bit like, we'll try and make that work in the future, but for now it feels like it's very hard to connect the two. So what do we got here? Yes. The friendship was, I think the friendship was real, but is fractured now because of Azula's actions. Yes, that's definitely the case. Azula tried, it's probably happened during the whole beach episode. So, it's definitely an interesting point here, but because I actually think, like, this is very key, because I think it is true, and I think a big moment to show her growth probably will be if she can ever regain the friendship with these two characters. And again, I think the way this will work is that I think Ty Lee will be the first to actually maybe try again with Azula. I can see Mai kind of holding off a little bit, and maybe Zuko is actually the one to ask Mai to maybe try again with Azula. But this is going to be like the key tester, because you assume, like, stuff like that, her family members, that stuff will work itself out. whatever relationship she ends up having with Kiyi and then Nora and Ikem, that'll work itself out. Ozai, you know, you don't know if they'll in any way attempt to involve him in the story. Same goes for sort of Iroh, where you think he's the sort of character who would want to help everyone out, but he's also the one who is like, you know, she's crazy and needs to go down. Now, at that point in that specific scenario, you get why he did that. But I do feel that Iroh's maybe holding back to let Zuko sort out the relationship with Azula. He's leaving this to kind of Ursa and Zuko. I think that's the way that this is going to work. Kind of like in the same way that, like, you know, how would Iroh and Ozai ever see eye to eye again type thing? Is he just going to let someone kind of make that happen and stuff like that? Ozai, I think I have the line here in relation to how she views Ozai. Yeah, Ozai was never part of the plan. And I just get the impression Into Smoke and Shadow, she just doesn't particularly care about him. There's that. Again, they've already done that, like, Ursa has a big scene with Ozai. Will they go as far as to have, like, Azula have a scene where she gets to say her piece to Ozai about her own problems with him? Is she going to maybe want to have or keep some sort of a relationship with him? I don't really know, but I think in the same way that, like, he probably just viewed her as a tool, I think she probably realizes at this point that is the case. That if she can accept not wanting the throne, that I think that speaks to the idea there's a fundamental difference in opinion. But like, either way, like, I think Iroh would want to see Azula do better. As much as he said that line, I don't read too much into it, because, you know, he's aware in that situation he wasn't going to change her at that moment. But like I said, I think the point about the arc is, and this is the part about what Arnie Has did say about the kind of Azula arc that I like the best, is that Iroh has helped Zuko to become the person who can help Azula, rather than needing Iroh to basically like fix everyone type thing. I think it's a really good move to have Iroh push these two to help Azula, if they're even going to involve Iroh that much in her arc, like, at all. But I think this is probably what has to happen first. Though, I don't know. Maybe if they really want to commit to this friendship being super important, maybe you can involve Mai and Ty Lee in a big way to make that happen, because you'd almost view the Mai betrayal moment as being kind of like the moment Azula's arc started going in a complete other direction. Yeah, won't get to have an opportunity to reach out to her. And yeah, that's the other thing. Like, Iroh's where he's sort of positioned at the end of the series right now as the sort of like fill-in Fire Lord for when Zuko does go out. It means that he's not particularly adventuring with the group to be there to deal with Azula in a lot of situations. But I think what you would want is just, I think everyone would like to see a scene where Iroh truly has a conversation with Azula. Even if he's not the one to make the breakthrough, you'd like to see just a relationship between those two. Iroh believes everyone could change. Yes. And yeah, he's optimistic. Yeah. Yeah, again, it's right not to focus in too much on the, you know, she needs to go down type situation. Maybe it's him just realizing that, like, she will only change once she gets defeated or something like that. But I don't think there's too much to read into about it necessarily. So this is the kind of key points here. And I've touched on it kind of like before. These type of things, the control through fear. And yeah, like this kind of really gets to like the kind of core of it, you know, true loyalty and friendship, you know. She can't bring herself to do this. She needs to make that leap. And when will she do that? And this is probably a decent moment, because we can continue to discuss Azula as we go through. Let's finally get into Azula in the Spirit Temple. Let's jump in here with this. First, I'll have a drink. Okay, so for anyone who's unaware, creative team, Faith Erin Hicks and Peter Wortman, coming out September 26th/27th, with this being a mass market date, and then the 27th being the comic book store date, Tuesday, Wednesday. Of course, delayed from summer 2023. Very frustrating. We don't know what happened in the sort of like 6-month gap between us first hearing that was the planned date and now. I'm assuming that this is just sort of like shipping stuff, because I trust that this team will probably have the book done well in advance of September. And that this is purely an organizing it to either just come out at a specific point in the year because they want it to come out at this point, or just because shipping delays that have continued from last year into this year, this is the way it's going to work. And now I hope they can stick to this. This is a big one for, like, you know, they've announced their first 2 proper books for this year, this and the Imbalance Omnibus. I really, really, really hope they can fix this. So there's that. Shipping backlog is affecting the comics, but mainly on the mass market side of things. Like, they've been hitting their dates in comic shops. So it's only one distributor that is being affected by this. Now, the problem is, when we get to September, will this be the date at the end overall? That's the kind of key thing. So, yeah. And then, it's coming out just before, New York Comic Con. And the other point about this is, like, is this part of a comic trilogy? We still don't know if there's going to be, like, another one-shot comic to follow this one up, or anything like that. It's a Korra one-shot trilogy as far as we're aware, but it's never been directly confirmed for this. So we don't actually know what, like, any sort of a comic after this is going to be, necessarily. So that's an interesting point. But anyway, here's the description. This is the full description from the Dark Horse website. So, Azula continues her destabilizing campaign against the Fire Nation and her brother Fire Lord Zuko, but after a failed attack on her latest target, Azula finds herself in a mysterious forest temple inhabited by a solitary monk, or is it something more mysterious? What first seems like a place to safely pass the night is quickly revealed to be something horrifyingly different. Azula is forced to confront her past and will finally face her chance at redemption. But will she take it? So, that's pretty big. We'll get into the analysis of this. Back when it was first announced, Faith Erin Hicks said this about the books on Twitter. Ridiculously excited about this book. I get to take Azula on a super dark journey. They are emphasizing this quite a bit about this book, in addition to the fact that they're saying that this is a very different one-shot comic than the other ones that we've seen. Now, one thing is that they're marketing this much more as, like, full on in collaboration with Avatar Studios. This is much more marketed on this book than any of the other ones. So this is where I'm assuming they're much more involved with the writers. Mike and Brian might have actually played a little bit more of a role in this one than they maybe have in more recent comics. Just because, like, it's the trajectory of Azula's arc, I assume they, focused a little bit in on that. It's the Azula story I've been dying to write, which is interesting given that Faith Erin Hicks, especially when she was first on the comics, talked about how she was borderline, like, almost afraid to write the character of Azula. But now it's a story she's been dying to write. So that's been an interesting kind of journey to see from her as a writer, building up to finally writing Azula for, like, not the first time, but, like, the first time advancing her story. So that's really, really important. So we do have 2 preview pages. Again, they're not finalized, but they showed them off, so I guess they're finalized enough. These are from New York Comic Con last year. So we have some sense for, like, what actually happens within the book. I assume these are very, very early pages in the book, which we'll refer to, of course. So they're interesting to note. I just have this as something to note in terms of the mask discussion, which we'll have to get into. But yeah, the big thing. The description finally confirms this book is set post Smoke and Shadow. That's the whole destabilizing campaign is exactly what's set up from at the end of Smoke and Shadow. This means advancement in Azula's story for the first time in 7 years. Smoke and Shadow Part 3 came out in 2016. Like, this is crazy. This is super crazy to think about. Like, 7 years between, like, a character with an open story getting any movement in their story. It's really crazy to think about. Especially because, like, we've technically been getting somewhat regular books in that gap. It's not like the comics just disappeared for 7 years. Like, okay, we immediately followed this up with North and South. Okay, different story. Fine, made sense. Bit of a gap as we switched creative teams and we got imbalance. And then that's when things started to go wrong. Like, obviously at that point then they finished Runes of the Empire and the Korra side of things. And that's more or less when Avatar Studios starts to come into play. And that's what we've been dealing with these last, say, 2-3 years, is the effect that early Avatar Studios has had on the comics, which is they have moved away from advancing the Avatar story past imbalance, which basically includes all stories set up in the comics, which is why we haven't had like any follow-up to the stuff in the Southern Water Tribe. We haven't had an advancement of Azula's story, and we haven't had an advancement of like the Cranefish Town into Republic City story. Then we moved like, oh, instead of that, we're doing one-shot comics, which aren't advancing the story. And we're only just getting back up and running now after basically, I suppose, the establishment of Avatar Studios. It's weird. And when you consider that, like, when the comics started back in, like, 2011, 2012, we went boom with, like, some of the earlier comics of, like, The Promise, immediately followed by The Search, immediately followed by The Rift. They led off, like, really strong in that, like, 3 of the better comics within, like, 3 years. And it's only gone sort of like downhill from a sort of like consistent release perspective after that point. And I'm not really sure what the plan is, because I think the big thing with Smoke and Shadow, North and South and Imbalance, is that they're all more setup books. Whereas The Promise, The Search and The Rift work sort of as standalone books, but they're also part of other stories. But like Smoke and Shadow needed like a somewhat like recent, after its release follow-up. North and South needed a somewhat recent follow-up. Imbalance needed a recent follow-up, and none of them got that. And that's why there's this real sense of like, it feels like we're just kind of starting again almost. But they have to address what's happened in this, because all of like Azula's story like really depends on a lot of what they've done in important comics like The Search and Smoke and Shadow. So let's get to analysing this kind of line by line. So, continues her destabilizing campaign against the Fire Nation and her brother Fire Lord Zuko. So that's obviously referencing these scenes here, right at the end of Smoke and Shadow. It's Azula reveals herself, and basically, this is what I have been doing. Like, this is why I'm doing this. I'm destabilizing the Fire Nation to force you to be, in my opinion, a better ruler. That's what they mean here. Because that's what she says. She knows she's not meant to be the leader, but she sort of wants to feel like she's kind of in charge because she's forced Zuko to be the way, she wants him to be. Then, the most notable thing here is failed attack. A failed attack. So, it seems like her efforts to change Zuko are not working. This is one failed attack, but have any of them worked? Will she begin to doubt her approach? Will this be the tension with the other Fire Warriors? With the preview pages, this pretty much has to confirm the idea of this separation, which again, when we looked at the Legends RPG information, also leaned in that direction. There's tensions, like Azula might go off on her own. The Fire Warriors might separate from her. And that seems to be the only way to interpret what's sort of happening here, If this is set post Smoke and Shadow, she's in out camping with other people, and said other people leave, and she's left on her own. Is she abandoned by the other fire warriors? That seems to be what happens here. In the aftermath of some attack, they fail, and they leave her. She doesn't leave them, it seems. They leave her. So it's just that idea of like, you know, like another betrayal for Azula. I should probably put it like more like this. Another betrayal. In that, like, it's obviously the way she is acting that is like causing other people to like do this to her. And when will she realize the one thing common among all these people leaving her? That's an important thing. That's really interesting just to note. And I like that they mentioned failed attack, that she is not succeeding. So then, the Spirit Temple itself and the solitary monk. So she seems to, while alone, realize that, oh, I kind of don't want to just be in a tent on my own in the middle of the forest. I'll go find the nearest building. And she comes across this temple, which is in the forest. Now, where exactly are they? So obviously I assume they're still in the Fire Nation if they're destabilizing the Fire Nation. So it's a forest temple somewhere in the Fire Nation. Now, where exactly this is it a specific island? Is it mainland Fire Nation? Who knows? So what is this temple? Is there a specific name on it or anything like that? So that's interesting. And then a solitary monk is inside. So what's going on here? What's going on with this idea? Especially because like they follow this up like immediately with from the description, a solitary monk ... Or is it something more mysterious? And is the monk what's mysterious and weird, or is it more the temple itself? And then like you're wondering if we're in a spirit temple, based on the cover again. Look at the cover, smoke and like. It's clear smoke on the bottom, but then clear like spirity patterns going on along the top side of the book, as if there's clearly some sort of spiritual stuff actually going on here. So what way are we going to make this work is the kind of like big thing with this, because unless it's revealed that this takes place on like Bonte Island, I'd be surprised if we're dealing with a member of the Bonte tribe. Now, it opens the door to maybe making that connection if you really, really want to, but I'd be surprised if they full on went in that direction, because, again, overall, it seems like the idea of what we're doing here is Azula gets shown, effectively, a spirit-like vision of her past, and, you know, stuff like that happens. And then, yeah, like the obvious thing is like there's a very much Mother of Faces kind of connection to all of this based on like what's going on there. But then Azula also has like a little bit of a connection to, I suppose, Kimura Kage type stuff. But as far as we're aware, Aang dealt with them in the physical world for the last time. And I don't think we're going to necessarily do anything there. So the question is obviously like, because they then go on to, you know, talk about the idea of like things happen like forcefully, horrifyingly so, like things go bad with all of this. How does it go so wrong with the monk there? Now, is it just because it's Azula? And so if Azula is shown stuff because of the position that she is in, this would be what makes things lean in like a dark spirit direction. That's an interesting thing by itself. But then, this is probably, I think, ends up being the key part of the description in terms of, I think, what the key stuff to analyze from this book is going to be. Azula is forced to confront her past. So, one, forced. So this, I think, implies that she will have to be shown a vision. Because, like, again, how is some random solitary monk going to know specifically everything about her past? So it feels like she has to be, like, literally shown it. And then when they say Azula's past. What do they mean by this? Because when I think of Azula and like her past, I don't think of one moment. I don't even know if I think of like a specific group of moments. It kind of feels like it just has to be like the entire like amalgamation of her behavior over her life, how she's conducted herself this last like entire while. Is it just that like she will be shown that, look, this is who you are, this is what you do, this is how you act, and how you have for the last couple of years. Are you okay with this? Is this how you truly are? And is that what they're going for here? Or is it referring to like one specific moment? Like, how is this actually going to work within the comic? In that, like, I'm thinking, like, the moment I think of when I think of this is sort of Azula shoots Aang in the Avatar state and basically kills him, unaware of the fact that the spirit water's around. The final Agni Kai, she aims at Katara, is dishonorable basically in an Agni Kai, and ends up nearly killing Zuko. And kind of just moments like that, the moments that even fans would say, like, these are the bad things that Azula did, that she would, in a redemption arc type situation, need to make amends for. How she took Ba Sing Se for the Fire Nation. How she attacked the Kyoshi warriors and so on. Those type of moments. Is that what they mean by this? This is probably the biggest thing in chat that I want to know. Like, when it says confront her past, what do you view that as actually, like, meaning? I just find it to be, like, in terms of, like, I think Azula needs to reflect on what she's done. What will they actually bring up in the book, and how will they do it? Because I'd actually quite enjoy seeing, like, if we just got to see, like, Peter Wortman drawing some interpretation of, like, one or two scenes from the show, and stuff like that. Yeah, everything she's done wrong, the relationship with her mom, that's definitely an interesting one. It could also address Azula killed Aang, how she actually feels. I imagine hitting Aang with the lightning, yeah. And then, yeah, maybe new things we don't even know. And that might be telling. Like, there's some interesting stuff that they could do. Like, what if there is some, like, giant reveal of, like, here is this really, really bad thing that we actually don't know that she was at the core responsible for. Do you think Azula might encounter a Phoenix Eel spirit and get those spirit visions like Yang Chen did? I think if it is a spirit vision, they'll do it in the same way, like, that we got it from, like, the Phoenix Eel. That, like, other characters have been shown, like, visions like that. The sort of, like, a kind of, like, insight chakra thing, like a spirit touching a person, or, like, Aang touches Heibai. They'll do that sort of vision thing. I don't know if it'll necessarily be a Phoenix Eel spirit that is the one doing it, but a spirit feels, I think, somewhat likely, ultimately. Mostly during the war. And then, probably one of the bigger ones. Azula's the one who comes up with the, like, burning Earth Kingdom plan. Technically. Now, obviously, Ozai executes on it, but she comes up with that idea. Maybe that's kind of, like, part of it, in that her idea directly kind of, like, led to, ultimately spiritual areas, I guess, of the world being taken out. We've never really touched on, I suppose, how much damage as such, like, they did there, in that, like, obviously certain sections got quite badly done, but we don't actually know. Maybe the temple's linked to the Fog of Lost Souls in some way. That'd be interesting. I'd be surprised, but we'll see what they do there. And maybe that's the thing, like what if Azula's, like, judged here in this moment of, like, in a way, like, if they don't view her as being capable of redeeming herself, she would be put into the Fog of Lost Souls, but maybe she is deemed worthy. Like there's some cool stuff that they kind of theoretically could do, but they don't want to reference stuff just for the sake of referencing stuff. So, like, like the idea that I think some people like kind of have in chat, like, what if like Lao Ge is the guy, or like what if it's Guru Patik at the temple? Like, it's cool to come up with those ideas that fit the idea of like a monk guru like character that we know about, but I'd be surprised if they did that. Like, it'd be an amazing moment to flip the page and be like, my name is like Tigwai the Immortal, and I'm here to help you, or something like that. And you're like, like just freaking out about it. But it feels a little bit like on the nose. That Lao Ge, we're waiting for him to show up in a different era and, like, I suppose fully reveal the extent to his immortality. But I don't know if with Azula is necessarily where we're going to do that. But anyway, that's it is a cool idea. But yeah, it seems like everyone is kind of thinking like, unless it's some new moment we didn't know about, it will just be her bad actions and kind of how she was. And I'm interested to see just the extent of it. Like, do they try and link it into like her issues with her mother coming into this, or what, and so on. And then of course this is the big one. She will finally face her chance at redemption, but will she take it? And this is a weird wording about it, in that I think a lot of people, when they started mentioning redemption around this book, is like, how in one book, keeping in mind that this is going to be a 80-page comic, technically it will be 72 pages of actual story content, how in that amount of time, after 7 years of waiting, are we going to do all of this stuff with Azula? And then, now that we sort of have some sense for like what the book is going to be about, how does she just face a full-on chance at redemption here in the temple? Now, if she's shown these visions, I guess she's shown them for a reason. And then, if it is a spirit, it's just like, you have looked at your past. How do you feel about it? What will you do now that you have seen how you are? And is it literally just going to be a case of like, the book will end with the idea of either that question left unanswered, or her saying sort of like, I will try to be better. And we don't know how exactly she's going to do that, but it's just, you end the book with like, boom, Azula is trying. That kind of is about the extent I'm maybe expecting from this. Because otherwise, like, how do they get to the idea of like, Azula will have a moment in the spirit temple where she can do the redemption like there and then? It's hard to imagine that without actually knowing what the actual circumstances are at the temple. And then will she take it? And that's the thing, is that the fear you have with the character is that because of where am I here? This document. Because of how like borderline like deluded, again, like I was referring to, the one step forward, two step back situation. Because this is fundamentally the Azula we're dealing with here in this comic. Do we trust her enough that she will make the decision? Now, she will be affected by having viewed her past. And we know she is capable of ultimately kind of like having moments where you can sort of like break through to her. And stuff can hit her. And you assume aspects of this will come out when she's confronted directly with her past. So what are we going to do here? That's the kind of like bigger thing here. Yeah, it's just a case of she's shown her bad actions and thus has a chance to make a clear change, or is there something more to it? Azula has schizophrenia. Yeah, I've seen some of these comments throughout this. Like, again, I don't claim to be an expert at any of these like conditions and stuff like that and how exactly they work. That's why like I'm not even making an attempt to particularly discuss it like myself, because I don't want to like speak poorly about it, and from a position of not actually knowing much about that situation. So I'll leave that aspect of the discussion, basically the, what sort of an actual like condition does Azula have, and does her arc need to include basically like proper like therapy type stuff, or can they just do a character arc to change the character, and that's kind of going to be enough? That's just my thoughts on that. I don't have the knowledge to go super in depth on that sort of stuff. But yeah, the big thing coming out of this, how far will the comic go? Like I said, just to make it clear here, we only have one book. So effectively, like a third of like an omnibus. One part of one of these stories is what this book is. This is not a giant book to cover the full story here. It's one book. How much can we actually do here? And what is the book actually truly setting out to do? And for me, there is probably very little chance of the kind of full redemption arc happening here. But they're saying it will be important, and I think it will be important, because what we've needed is a transition point between Smoke and Shadow and wherever they're going with the character. Now, will the net result of the book mainly be sort of separating her from the Fire Warriors, or will it actually be about sort of like the character growth? Because I think that's what we want. Is it'll be okay if they do this, because I think this is probably what they have to do. But I think everyone wants to see the character come out of this book in a way where you just have a sense for where her arc is going. I think that's the big thing. I'm just hoping to better understand where Azula is and where she's going after this book. Yeah, that's it. We want to know the kind of... That's what we need for the character. That's what this has to do. Because I think Smoke and Shadow has got us into a decent position in terms of she's kind of regained her clarity to a certain degree, but it's by kind of putting up the walls again a little bit. This needs to be showing us what we're actually going to do, because it's ultimately like, you know, that's what we assume is happening here. The arc, this is building up, this is set up to put Azula in a position so that she can be the focus character in either this first Avatar movie, potentially Echoes and Aftershocks, or this rumored second one that is more Zuko focused. That's, I think, what they have to do here. Because I think what's going to help here is that they don't want, when they go into this movie, they don't want to have to explain why Azula suddenly has a group of people. Because they have to assume not everyone has read the comics. And even though we hope more people read the comics, you don't want to deal with that level of complexities where the Fire Warriors are a cool idea, but in the grand scheme of things, it's more important that people just know that, like, Azula is out on her own post-series. That's what's important to know going into this, like, movie. Azula's out on her own, and she's in this weird spot where she's hindering people in some ways, helping people in some ways. Where will she go? Characters realize that they need to find her to finally figure out what's going on, because she's too chaotic as an entity or something like that. That's what they kind of are going to have to do. Because again, when you think about, like, what is the plot of the movie? What did they do for that movie? And then a Zuko-focused movie. What's that plot? No, it's hard to immediately jump to, well, what's open? Because I feel we've we've done a bit too much focus on Republic City already with the intro to it in Imbalance. The ending, effectively, of the story is covered in Korra. So, unless we're dealing with the direct, like, this is the day of founding of the United Republic of Nations, Republic City, and that exact sort of middle point, what exactly is the plot that we're dealing with here? And that's where Azula, with the open arc, is ideal to do this with. And people would latch onto that as an idea of, like, okay, we're dealing with it again. Like Azula, like people who know the comics, Azula's final kind of arc as a villain. And will that be how they do it? Will this end with sort of, she denies the redemption? Will this be Azula's crossroads of destiny moment where she makes the wrong choice, but they give you enough that you know that there is a core potential for change there with the character that in the right situation she'll make, which is Zuko's arc throughout the whole first half of book 3. Will they do that? And so this will be where you see that turn happen. Or will this end with Azula in a weird spot? Will this be a sort of, maybe they do an anti-hero transition for the character, where it's an actual step forward, maybe one step forward, one step back, and she's in this different position that still needs the other characters to kind of like deal with. But I worry just because her arc is going to require Ursa, and then they're going to need to explain what happened to Ursa to people who haven't read the comics. So how exactly are you kind of like doing that is kind of like a big thing. That's the thing. They need to improve helping get new fans into the reading material. They're not discussed as much. Yeah, people ask the same questions. Yeah. Definitely. And this is the thing. Avatar Studios can do this. Like, they just need a website. Literally, I think if Avatar just put up, like, Avatar Studios' official website, and they just had very, very basic tabs of, like, here's how you can watch the shows. Here are a list of comics and books with the reading order. And an idea of, like, a general idea of this is what happens in this comic. Like, the stuff that, like, we have out there as fans, but other fans don't necessarily kind of come across. They need to bring it to the surface to some degree, because they've said already they're not going to do adaptations for these things. So we're not getting The Search, in animation or anything like that. Which to me, and they've directly, I think, said as well, we're going to see characters from like the comics appear in these shows and stuff like that. And they're alluding to the idea that, comic fans will know who this character is. Other people will effectively be meeting them for the first times. So how are you going to do that? Because the reality of it is, going back here, is that the big one is obviously like, Ursa, of course. Oh, Zuko's mom is just back? What? And then Ki, of course, you have to explain. Because this is Zuko's, like, other sister. Like, she's here. She's gonna be around. She's a firebender now. You can't ignore this. And then there's a bunch of other comic characters where you probably will have to mention, at a certain point as well, because they are, relatively important. Like, if we ever do stuff with the Southern Water Tribe, you have to mention Melina, because Hakoda's in a relationship with her. And I'm assuming there'll be a kind of like a Hakoda second marriage type thing that happens at some point. So, like, this is going to be like Katara's new mother type situation. So, you're going to have to address a lot of that stuff. And it's tough because you want the comics to feel important, but you don't want people to feel like they have missed everything because they haven't read the comics. And there's bad ways to do it, there's good ways to do it. For instance, if anyone's watched The Dragon Prince season 4, book 4, did this terribly. they had a very important comic release in between season 3 and 4. It's set in between the seasons. And they actually had important stuff happen in that comic that actually showed you kind of a little bit ahead of time what the direction was going to be heading into season 4. Basically where characters are going to be as you start post time skip. And that was out like a year before book 4 actually dropped. And the way that they approached tackling the information within that comic was just like terrible in all regards. It didn't help people who knew the material because it felt like the comic was just ignored. And then people who didn't read the comic were like, wait, what happened? You didn't say what happened. And it's just like stuff happened off screen. And it's just you did it wrong in every single sense of the word. You don't want them to just do like that. And maybe they'll just do like a previous line Avatar thing, and you'll get the search adaptation through a brief recap of events that alludes to stuff that happened. Because when you really break it down, like I suppose the whole Ursa situation, you can explain it with just the idea of like that, yeah, Ozai told the truth. She was banished. Yes, there's technically all this other stuff that happened with spirits that makes it more complicated. But when you really break it down, the reality of it is that what people need to know is just that they eventually found where she was and she had a new family. How in depth do you need to go into the sort of like forget memories plot is an interesting one, but you can do it without, I think, having to read out the full comic type thing. Like again, they can do work officially to better promote the comics. In that, I don't know, like I'd be relatively okay. I don't know from like a publishing perspective if they'd want to do this, but like if they just like officially put up like the animated like comic kind of versions of these comics online, like in full on their YouTube channel. I know they have like somewhat detailed recaps up there already, but like there are like other channels that just have like the comics like in full up that haven't been taken down. If they just officially put the comics just like up on the channel, that would, I think, help. Now, they could I think to really get people to read them, they could do with having like someone either reading it out in full, voice acting, like making a performance out of it. And I mean like a proper performance, not one of the live stream ones where, you know, they're dealing with like connection troubles like they did during like early COVID and stuff like that. Not quite that, but you know they have options to do, and I have guides up on my channel. I think Avatar, like the Avatar Reddit, has like a bunch of like kind of like information pages that they link to when people ask the basic questions, and there's lots of stuff like that. But again, there is the situation of like us as fans can only do so much to help other fans, because straight away you look at it like my subscriber count compared to the subscriber count of the official Avatar channel. Look at the response to some of the polls that you get on that channel. There are some people in the Avatar fandom that I'll never reach. And they can reach them themselves doing like official stuff, and that's again, they need proper social media channels, they need a website to get this information more concrete, because so many people don't have a clue what Avatar Studios is. It's very secretive right now. If you're not in the know, keeping track of everything on a day-to-day basis. Now, to be fair, I think one problem with the comics is, straight away, I do not understand in any way why they don't just have a number on these. Why they don't, like, especially the omnibus editions, why don't they just have a volume 2 on the search? Why don't on Smoke and Shadow don't they have a volume 4? Why does nowhere in this just tell you which volume it is? Because there's only 6 of them. Like, it's not that complicated, but all, like, literally a number on each book is all you need to make this clear. But they just go for the individually named ones, and it's not complicated to explain it to anyone, but it's like the problem fixes itself if you just include volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it's done. And that's caused so much problems for people because so many people know about the search, but it's comic 2. But you don't have to read The Promise first, but you probably should. And it's all this like weirdness about that. So there's all of that stuff. Anything else to say about Azula's Spirit Temple? Okay, yeah, the mask thing. So let's have this discussion based on this. Because this was the main speculation that came out when it first came out. Context seems to point to the idea that this scene is portraying the other fire warriors, the other Khmer Kage members, basically, leaving Azula. And so she picks up a Khmer Kage mask left behind by her former followers and burns it. But at least to me, this mask does not look like this mask. At all. And I don't think you can quite explain it away as just, well, different artist. This is Giri Hura's version of the mask, this is Peter Wortman's version of the mask, because they should still look similar. And they just blatantly look different. And I'm not trying to, like, immediately lean in the direction of this means it's not the Khmer Kage, the Fire Warriors leaving Azula. But I also don't want to believe that there's such a bad sort of transition between artists in place when the design of this mask is so, like, important and clear because it's meant to be accurate to an actual spirit and be the same group from before. And yeah, this one does look more like the kind of Ursa style theater masks and stuff like that. That would be an interesting little thing if she just happened to find like a mask that reminds her of like her mother and all the plays they went to see. But we'll see. Post Smoke and Shadow, it would be different. It depends. Like we don't even know when this is set. Like if this is set like a couple of weeks, I don't know if they changed their masks in just that small amount of time. If it's been like 6 months, maybe they've adjusted the masks. But because the masks are meant to be a very, very specific thing, I don't know. It's hard to say. But at least reading the scene, like it seems to be she's annoyed at being alone. The mask was left behind as well. She burns it, representing like, oh, more people have left me. We'll see what happens there. So I don't know. Maybe this is something that just the feedback of like, well, if this is what it's meant to be, I don't think it's portrayed super well. Maybe it can be fixed, or maybe it is accurate and it's just meant to be a theater mask. We'll have to wait and see. The other point here is that like, if this is say like Azula has gone to sleep and is woken up here, this could all be like some sort of a vision. Like what if during this point here, she's already like in her vision, that they haven't actually left her. She just thinks they've left her because that's how Azula feels about the people around her. And then if she's going down this like forcibly being shown the past, what if she walks forward, finds a mask that reminds her of Ursa? What if in the next shot we go in and there she sees like Zuko? And next shot she sees like Iroh or something like that, Ozai. And it is just this crazy thing of like she's having like a spirit encounter in the forest. I think, you know, I'm not sure if that really works because she goes to stay at the temple and then stuff happens. But, you know, it's just an interesting idea. We don't actually know when this takes place in the comic. We assume it's early on, but it might not be there. Their cover as Khmer Kage has been blown by this point, so the mask may have changed. Yeah, that's actually probably one of the most obvious kind of things. You know, but you maybe question like, why do they still wear masks? I guess to differentiate them, maybe just to protect Azula, so no one specifically knows which one is Azula. But we'll see. We'll see if this ends up being important or not, because we could very much still come out of this by the end of the book not really knowing what the mask was particularly meant to represent or anything like that. But anything else here? I suppose the question is, like, it's obviously going to be like an Azula story focused book where, like, it's Azula, maybe some early stuff that includes some other fire warriors, whoever this solitary monk is, and then, like, is most of the book just going to be like her being shown her past? Is there going to be full on dialogue with this monk? It's going to be interesting to see what way it kind of like flows as a comic overall. And then, because it's this weird situation we haven't quite had before of, like, it's a one-shot comic that's advancing the story, but can't, like, complete the story itself, because we now have the capacity to tell stories in the most important places like we can. Like, animated projects are back on the table now, so they don't only have the comics to tell stories with. So that's what's very interesting about this. But for Dark Horse, I think it's a very important book, because it's going to show that, like, hey, the comics are still important, even though you have a bunch of animated projects on the horizon. That's an important thing to do. And now, obviously, like, what do they follow this with is important. That's going to be a key thing. Like, can they do a sequel to this? Will that be maybe what they do, where, like, they can't just call it Azula in the Spirit Temple Part 2, because it's very different than that. Maybe it might be another Azula follow-up. Or did they move on? And do they say, like, maybe the next one is more of a Water Tribe focus book? Maybe it's Sokka focus book, and it's Sokka post, North and South. Something like that. Or, post Imbalance, they go back to the South, Sokka up to stuff. There's a chance to do stuff there. Because I think that's what the comics are probably going to, like, in a way, like, exist to do at this point, is to just move characters along into positions so that how they're portrayed in the movies is quite clear. Sokka probably is the one who needs, like, the most, like, shift, I think, in that, like, we need him to get his sword back. We probably need to develop him a little bit more as, like, a leader. I wish North and South had, like, included him a little bit more in maybe some of the politics stuff going on. So that could be used. And then, on the core side of things, the Mako one-shot. Hopefully that's given the same importance. Because, at this point, like, do we think the Mako comic is actually going to make it this year? If the Zula comic has basically been delayed by, like, what? At the very least 2 months. If the Mako comic, which was already, like, just about a 2023 book, if it also receives, like, a 2-month delay, is it making it this year? Because it's not going to be September, so, like, either way, it's probably after this. So it feels like at earliest it's maybe, like, a November book, but it might be delayed into December, or it might be the first 2024 book. I think it needs. I hope it makes it this year. I think it probably needs to make it this year, because I think the comics just need Avatar and Korra going at the same time. We've had it so few times in the history of the comics that I think we just do need to get that back in place for sure. So yeah. Does anyone have any final thoughts on the Azula comic speculation? Is there any other angle to the discussion to have? The past, I think, is very important, what they bring up. How will she face a chance at redemption? Who is the monk? How spirits will get involved? How will they deal with the fire warriors? There's a ton of potential, and it's difficult to, I suppose, manage expectations for something like this, because it's important. Like, they're making it clear it's important, but it's only the same amount of time. Let's see. Azula's design, I suppose. Yeah, the torn cape. Does that mean anything, or is that just for like it's Azula on her own, type thing, as wandering Azula? I think they might bring that Roku Sozin dynamic. Yeah, we're waiting for, of course, official announcement of the Mako comic. I'm wondering, like, as well, like, the follow-up to this, like, what the next Avatar comic is going to be. We should probably know, because if it is going to be Peter Wortman and Faith Erin Hicks doing the next one as well, they're a pretty well-oiled machine team who can get the books out, like, 4 months between each. That's pretty much the way they can release them. So that would make the potential next Avatar comic like a January release. I think so. That would be one where towards the end of the year we should know what is next, and then of course the Mako comic should get announced. I just want to know how she's going to confront her past. And that's the thing. Like it has to be either because she's in a spirit temple, some sort of weird guru chakra stuff, and she sees it that way and just reflects in her own mind that we're shown on it, or literally a spirit forces her to see her past, like we've seen has happened before. That, Roku is able to show Aang his entire history. We see the Phoenix Eel spirit can literally show Yang Chen what another person is experiencing. The spirits are capable of doing stuff like this. So there's a lot that they can do. And again, the whole face situation going on here is kind of some sort of situation here. Azula with spirits, I think, is a very interesting kind of concept, because she has had encounters with spirits now because of the search. But you don't really know what her perspective is on spirits. She obviously knows they're real and they have power. But what else? Spirit temple's like the swamp, so she sees where her destiny could be. Yeah, then that's the other point. The whole idea of Azula and destiny, that also gets brought up as well. Again, I do think I have that here. And then there's this one as well. This is one idea that I've always had for Azula as a character, that why does Azula set up such a theatrical situation at the end of Smoke and Shadow? Why does the confrontation happen here? Basically in the first Fire Lord's most trusted advisor, his tomb, basically, this crypt. That's where it takes place. And is that the idea of Azula? That she could become the most trusted advisor to Zuko. That it's not to change him into the Fire Lord that she would have been, but to assist Zuko to be the Fire Lord he can be. Now, she can still do that by having maybe more of a dark turn of things, of if Zuko's the optimistic Fire Lord, you want to keep him that way to help the Fire Nation going forward. But you need someone to be strong. You sometimes need to do maybe tough things. What if Azula takes the position of I will do those things to protect you as the optimistic Fire Lord? Basically, the Naruto Sasuke dynamic at the end of that series. Sasuke, basically, his redemption effectively for everything bad that he did is effectively, I will stay away from the village most of the time, but be the kind of sentry, always on the lookout for a threat to the village, and try and deal with it ahead of time, and do all this sort of spy work stuff that, Naruto, you should not worry yourself with, because you need to be the Hokage, the leader of the village. And they might do something like that. That's always been an idea that is definitely possible with the character, in that Azula has skills that could be useful to Zuko if she helped him. But the problem right now is that she would have to change before you transition her into that idea. But I like this idea. And Azula points out the idea that, like, it's almost forgotten in a way in history, this guy. Who, like, the importance of the Fire Lord's most trusted advisor. He has this crypt, but no one really knows about it. And, is that Azula, just kind of in a way, like, destined to kind of do important things, but not be maybe remembered for them? But yeah, we're talking about the idea of, like, destiny. Once I discovered my own destiny, that voice in my head finally shut up. And this is an interesting one in terms of, like, we don't actually know what happened here. We don't know how she changed to, like, get to this place, as far as we're aware. This happened off screen in between the search and Smoke and Shadow. That she has embraced the idea that she isn't meant for the throne, but obviously has taken things in a different direction. That also doesn't seem quite right. But destiny's important. Like, to some degree, you could say most of the royal family members have dealt with the idea of what their destiny is. Clearly, like Ozai, just the direct, next Fire Lord, it's his destiny, in a way, to end the war for the Fire Nation with the comet. Iroh misinterpreted his destiny to take Ba Sing Se as take it for the Fire Nation. No, actually take it back from the Fire Nation. Zuko, of course, was his destiny to quote-unquote regain his honor and become the prince of the Fire Nation again. No, it was for Ozai. No, it was to regain his honor by basically helping to end the war and becoming the Fire Lord that would guide the Fire Nation in the right direction. Azula has misinterpreted her destiny here, clearly, as I need to force Zuko to be the leader in the way I want. I need to help Zuko to be that leader. To be the leader in his way. But that involves Azula understanding why Zuko's way is the right way. Which is something that she needs to grow to do. So, yeah. Could it be possible that Azula merged with a spirit and got some kind of boost or change? Well, this is the thing, like, is there... I'll just type this out, actually, just so we have it here. This has been brought up a lot with the whole Khmer Kage thing, is that they all seem to have this ability to, like, just produce smoke at will. And is this just firebending to make smoke? Is it a smoke spirit making this that maybe Azula actually knows? I'm not really sure. We know firebenders can make smoke. It is often something they don't choose to do as such. It seemed a bit weird that, like, it never got, like, explained as such, despite being, like, a plot point. But because Khmer Kage literally means, like, what, smoke shadow, that's just the idea that they went with. And again, like, that speaks to, I suppose, the idea here is, like, smoke spirit? Is that what we're kind of, like, talking about here? I'm not really sure. Because a lot of the time what we see smoke is, like, when a firebender, like, does their firebending, like, wrong, it kind of, in some way, it can, like, either cause, like, an explosion if you put too much power into it, or if you're, in a way, too weak with it, it's like a poof of smoke. So there's almost the idea that, like, if you kind of, like, do it in the right way, it can create smoke, which feels okay. But the way it's done in the book, it feels like they almost have, like, almost like a machine strapped onto them that just produces the smoke, rather than it being like a firebending effect that they're just subtly doing while doing other stuff. At this point, it feels like this is probably, like, too much down the road of, like, wild speculation as such, in terms of, like, what exactly is being done here. And stuff like that. Like, you have the, quote-unquote smoke bending, the kind of heat redirection kind of thing that Sozin does, which I've always viewed more as being heat redirection, and they show that he's doing something by having it look like smoke being sucked out to highlight the idea that he's like more manipulating heat. But if he can manipulate heat, I guess he can make smoke. And there's the other one is this is probably the most notable one about it. I think it's Zuko and G on the boat when they're about to almost go fight each other, and they have their hands up against each other like that, and they're about to firebend. Smoke starts coming off from like the contact point, and Iroh's like steps in to stop it. So they kind of sizzle in a way, like just like half firebending. So it is something they can do, kind of. It'd be interesting to note it. Smoke is probably a little bit like glass bending, ultimately, where it's like, it's a cool ability, but it's not super practical to use a lot of the time, when something else can do probably just as much, ultimately. There's that as well. So, you know, the whole spirit aspect is kind of interesting. Tokuga Yun. Yeah, that's the other thing with the Azula thing, is she's combined with a spirit and it's been somewhat permanent. We should have seen, I think, some more physical effect on her. Otherwise, it almost like counters like what we know about like spirit merging, where like you either have to weaken and consume a spirit so that you've like contained the power, or you only briefly connect, then deconnect, like kind of Wan and Rava initially, and that sort of thing. Or else you do the spirit passes through you and kind of leaves something behind situation, like, which is more the Tokuga situation. So there's all that sort of stuff. There's a reference there. Yeah, in the Kyoshi novels, and yeah, Kyoshi learning firebending, I think, and then yeah, doesn't Rangi also do a moment as well, like to almost like, I think this is before she reveals she's the Avatar to the group. Like Rangi like fakes like being bad at firebending for a moment to like, it was like, oh yeah, I did that one. Sorry guys. And like Kira makes fun of her, and like it's just like, oh yeah, you know, bad firebending creates a smoke type situation. So there's all that stuff. But yeah, that's just a very random point. If this means anything, that's that. But yeah, we are, you know, towards the end here of the discussion. Maybe, you know, we should maybe go back and maybe tackle some of the like other more general stuff, like we've discussed. The speculation on the comic. Let's go back now and discuss some of the Azula character points that we discussed at the start. So the comic is leaning in a way, okay, she's going to be shown her past. So how does that affect stuff like her redemption, us feeling sympathy for the character, and so on? How does that affect potentially like how we're going to see the relationship with Ursa, you know, change in some way? And then how will this be tackled? How will this be tackled in this comic? Because I think we are seeing this kind of fail again. I think that's what they're teasing, is that if she's been left by the others, the idea of like true loyalty is completely broken. I suppose it has to be at her. That even these people who she helped out of the mental institution or whatever happened in that situation, they've also abandoned her too. So it is another situation of like Azula being placed on her own when maybe she didn't want to be alone. And will this finally make her kind of see things correctly? That the reason she is often placed alone is because of this. Because she always does this. And she can't do anything else. And yeah, that's a good point there. You know, they may have to do more because even with showing her past, without knowing that what she did was wrong, you know, she won't change unless it's like pointed out to her very clearly, and she gets that this has caused this, and that's the problem. Oh yeah, and then we do have to discuss the overall approach, like when she looks back on things. I suppose this is the question: is like she's shown her past and certain like key moments. Like it depends on what selection you do. Like if you show her all of these kind of like moments of like, say, here's the betrayal of Mai, here's the betrayal of Ty Lee, she'll just be angry because those are the moments that broke her. But if you show her like that, like in context of like, imagine she was shown a scene of like Mai talking to Ty Lee about their true feelings about Azula, and then showed the betrayal scene, that would hit home a little bit more. Her seeing something she maybe hasn't seen before, but that's not part of her past, as such. So, what's going to open her up like emotionally, so that she actually views this in the right way, probably does have to be like stuff in a way with like her mother, like because she seems to have skewed views on how a lot of those situations went. Again, like we discussed, the idea of, she says publicly, my mother thought I was a monster. She was right, you know, but she says that out loud. But then her hallucinations always show Ursa being the kind, nice mother to her, like, I love you, Azula. And if she is directly shown that here is the past, like, in a way, this is actually an interesting point. This is part of her past. Now, she wasn't, you know, she was asleep when it happened. If she is just literally shown this moment, that when Ursa left, she did say goodbye, that could be like a relatively big moment if framed correctly. Moments like this highlighting that the part that you think is like fake, the kind Ursa stuff, is actually more real than the she thinks I was a monster type situation. And then it would be interesting if like this is a developed Azula and we saw more scenes of like, say, how Ozai more directly like dealt with Azula, what that was actually like, and she looks back on that kind of poorly now and kind of realizes that like, oh, a lot of how I view my past is kind of like different now looking back. There's a lot of kind of bits and pieces just because you have kind of these moments like this. This is very, very important because you can see this hits here coming from a character she knows doesn't remember her at this point. If she was directly told that like full on Ursa does actually feel that way, that's going to like get through to her and reflect like if some of her actions are informed by like her view on how her mother felt about her and that was wrong, that would change how she approaches things, and so on. So there's a lot of depth I think to get into with this stuff, because again you do have these complicated dynamics here about, you know, how you view Ursa as a mother, but also how you view Azula's behavior in all of this, and reflecting on the past ultimately and what all this actually really kind of means deep down. And all of this stuff is important, you know, like the kind of true effect of like, we never really tackle it too much, but how did Ursa's banishment affect Azula? And if this is the actual key dynamic, that might be super, super important. But then like, why does she run away? I obviously because she's not used to dealing with these kind of really strong feelings and doesn't know what to do, but it's interesting. Where are we gone here? But yeah, this needs to change. What she views as being strong and weak also kind of interesting. Like, if she looks back on this, and maybe if she's shown, like, say, Zuko moments, it's kind of interesting. That's that. Yeah, like that. She's weak in her own way. That she's not strong. If she reflects on that, Zuko actually is strong. Just changing these kind of points here, and then like with Ursa, it's kind of like this idea of like how she views it is that like, okay, so Azula thinks that she herself, in a really honest moment, is basically saying that Azula herself views that she is a monster. That's her own opinion on herself, which is not shared by her mother. That's kind of an interesting dynamic. That's sort of like Azula's "I'm angry at myself" moment, isn't it? If you link into that strong enough, that this is the kind of core of it. It's that, you know, I ultimately chose to kind of lean into this idea where I became this cruel person, you know, quote unquote, the monster, the villainous Azula, and I fully embraced it, and I tried to kind of like explain it away by thinking that it was, you know, it was the way my mother viewed me, but it wasn't actually, because the worst thing that Ursa says to Azula with regards to this is sort of, she like scolds Azula runs off, and I think Ursa just to herself is just sort of like, you know, she says something along the lines of like what is wrong with that girl, which is very different than saying she is a monster. Like, she's demonstrating traits that make her come across as a monster or like a psychopath or something like that. There's a big, I think, gulf between those two statements. Now, I don't know, maybe there is a point at which Ursa said something like that, but we've not been shown it as such, so you kind of wonder, where did this really come from? And then how much of like Azula's view on Ursa in a way comes from maybe like Ozai kind of like bad-mouthing her in front of why am I getting the characters mixed up here? Ozai bad-mouthing Ursa in front of Azula. And that's maybe where her perspective a little bit on her mother comes from. But yeah, you know, what was wrong with that child? So yeah, I was right there. That's about sort of as strict as it goes. Otherwise, it feels like Ursa gives Azula like normal kind of parent punishments for like bad behavior for the most part. Now, you can sort of have the discussion about the idea of, you know, like Ursa favored Zuko over Azula because we are presented with more scenes of like Ursa bonding with Zuko over Azula, but again, that's because the show is more from like Zuko's kind of perspective on that side of things than from Azula's perspective. And this is where like we need time to explore this dynamic, and if they could get more in depth on this, it could be important. And of course, there are reasons behind that. Ursa kind of had to do that because if she didn't, then Zuko like has very little. If he's not getting much from his mother and his father, he doesn't really have anyone. And there's that. Let's see. Yeah, and that is the other thing with Ursa, is that yes, she is put in this quite bad situation where her kids are like the only good thing. So there's that. Because look, Ursa obviously does have stuff to I suppose apologize for. Like you could criticize her to some degree for her decision to forget her kids, But you have to also be understanding of that situation. Again, it's a nuanced thing here, where she was effectively banished and more or less told that, like, if I see you again, if you come back, if you interact with the kids again, Ozai's effectively like threatening both of them. And that's the kind of weird situation of, like, she ultimately doesn't have the power to save them from Ozai, so she just has to stay back and trust Ozai keeps to his word that he won't harm them while she stays away. And she just exists sort of like never getting to see them, but knowing they're okay, but she doesn't get to ever see them or interact with them or start kind of a new life again, knowing that they'll be okay, because she won't ever break that issue. There's that. So there's that. Let's see. And then in the comics, like, she does try and argue that, like, hey, I've got you the throne. In a way, why do you need the kids as such? Let me take them. Like, you have more kids with someone else, almost, type thing. There's that aspect. That's kind of interesting. But yeah, like, we don't get too focused on Ursa here when we're discussing, like, Azula. But when you get down to it, I suppose there has to be both sides of that discussion here, which is, Ursa apologizing to Azula about certain things, but also Azula finally sort of being more open and connected to her mother. And that's the kind of point here. There's a bit of a, like, what is a good mother type situation going on here. But again, Avatar and what is a good or a bad parent, given what happens with the Aang is a good or bad parent situation, I'm inclined to be like, look, unless the character is doing some pretty bad things, if a character is shown to care and try as a parent, I think that's good ultimately. And to me, like, Ursa's put in a crazy position. Like, some crazy things happen that prompts that decision, and it's like, if she doesn't make that decision, what? It's weird. Like, it's a decision that only really affects kind of like how she's viewed by, like, outsiders viewing the story, because Zuko, for instance, accepts that decision because he understands completely, like, why in that situation she would make that decision, knowing more of the facts. Maybe Azula doesn't accept that, though, and that's fine as well, and that's the kind of whole point of it. Like, that is a good point. The letter, the fake letter, which ends up being revealed as effectively one of the main reasons why Zuko takes so much kind of pain in a way from Ozai, is that even though Ozai ultimately knows it's not true, he punishes Ursa for that, like, act of defiance by punishing Zuko. And, like, yes, she, I suppose, technically caused this to happen, but it's very, it's such an awkward thing to do, to blame Ursa for ultimately Ozai's actions in that situation, when, like, he doesn't have to do that just because that is what happened, given the whole situation. Azula doesn't know it's fake. Do you think she's affected by not being a child of her favored husband? I assume that means, is Azula affected by not being that of like Ikem not being Azula's father? Is that what that means? Yeah, I suppose that gets into the whole key situation. Like, how is wait, where do I have that? I think it's just down here. Yeah, because I don't think we really went into this too much. How is Azula going to interact with Ki? Because like they don't really interact in Smoke and Shadow, even though like they're right there. Oddly, Azula makes very little comment on Ki. Despite the, initial reveal, her being like quite shocked at the whole idea, like have it, where is it? Yeah. Did you have to have a new daughter because the last one turned out to be such a monster? That initial reaction, but then they don't do anything really with it. The impression I get is that like the dynamic with Ki is probably going to be that like Ki isn't going to be like afraid of Azula. She isn't, I guess, afraid of Azula. And when they have a more normal conversation, this could be a weird situation where just Azula can't bring herself to be like mean to Ki. And then rather than being like a replacement, kind of view it as like you now have another sibling. And that's the interesting thing, I think, for Azula, is that like Zuko is trying to be a better big brother to her. Now she has an opportunity to be like a big sister. And how does she interact in that situation, which is different? She's not really used to that. That could be kind of key going forward. And like, especially because you have the whole thing of like Ki also calls Zuko like Zuzu, and that's like Azula's nickname for him, and that's interesting. Let's see. Let's see. Smoke and Shadow. There is someone who comments, but at least in my memory, I think it might just be, is it just a Kimura Kage member, one of the others, who mentions that like, oh, she's kind of fierce, and then like Azula just goes like, let me try and find that if I can. So, okay, that's not that. So it would have to be part 3, basically, wouldn't it? Yeah, you can see it here. It's probably not that great on screen here, but it's more this page, actually. There's 2 masks, Kimura Kage. Ki kind of like stands up for herself, and one of them says at the bottom here, that one's got fight in her. It's in her blood. And it's a little unclear, like, if it's the one that ends up being like Azula, or if, on the following panel, when they like, because like you go from, was it down here, these 2, to the next panel, and it's everyone like unmasks. It's really unclear like who said what. I'd be more inclined to maybe think it's one of the others commenting about it, that like almost they are aware that like Azula and she are related, and they note some similarities between the 2 rather than Azula doing it. But it's interesting. I don't really know, because otherwise it kind of feels a little bit weird if like it is actually Azula who says that like she's praising like the idea of like, oh yeah, she's related to Ursa, so that fight is in her blood, like, and referring to it in that way, it's kind of a little odd, but I'm not sure what to really make of that. Um, hmm. So yeah, the key characters for Azula to kind of interact with, of course. Because again, we are ultimately expecting that. Oh yeah, sorry, I'm talking about here. So we more or less came to the conclusion: the Azula comic will do something to put Azula in a position where she will grow, or will have a better idea about where she's going to grow. But that it will be an animated project where she actually has that growth. Where does she end up? Like, what is the end goal for Azula as a character? And this gets into the whole, like, what does the redemption at the end of the day, like, look like? There's as I've already presented, the idea, does she become sort of an advisor to Zuko once she, changes a bit? There's that. Does she work as basically like the shadow of the Fire Nation, where she basically becomes more kind of like anti-hero style thing? Let's see. How do we know it's an animated project? Oh, sorry. I should probably put this here just to make this clear. I'm assuming her arc will finish in one of the Avatar Studios animated projects. And so far, as far as we're aware, all of their projects are animated. There's the movie, potentially called Echoes and Aftershocks, and there's the rumored Zuko, also animated movie as well. They're the two likely options where the Azula story will happen. And the question is, what do they do? Do we see Azula as a villain for the last time? She gets defeated by everyone and finally has those character dynamics, talks to her mother, opens up to Zuko, tries again with like Mai and Ty Lee as friends, and we go from there. Or what more do we do? There's the more spiritual arc of like, if you maybe do lean in the direction of like Azula becomes a member of the Bonte tribe and is that person that we see, which I don't think is really the case. But the option of just a spiritual arc for Azula, if she has like a spiritual encounter here, is an opportunity like to do something very different with the character, but we don't really know. And then just like, will she play a more active role, or will she be more low key in the aftermath of this? Because like, what the end of like Arani has, when he gave his opinions on the like Azula arc they'd always planned for, his end game was that like the Azula at the end would be this like surprisingly like oversharing like emotional character. Now that was more the personality aspect, not necessarily like where she's positioned, but that's perhaps a step too far. We'll see what exactly they attempt to do in all of this. We'll see about that. It's always about like speculating about what the actual story will be here, and where that will position Zuko. What will he be dealing with that prompts him to have to interact with Azula again, and all these sort of things. And yeah, like I discussed much earlier on, where was it? It was like, yeah. In like the first kind of point I think I was making about like the idea of the redemption, again, how far we go with this is keeping in mind that, we can be nuanced with this. Like, this is not necessarily just a full-on character 180 for Azula, that this can be anti-hero style things, we can have more subtle things, and it still be a redemption. And for most people, I think the idea is that we just want to see an arc where she comes out of it as not always the villain. She can still have villainous traits and do things that not everyone agrees with, but we get a new side to her that we don't typically see because she's not always the villain. That she can still be cruel and manipulative when required. And imagine that as like a tool that like Zuko and the others can kind of use. That a lot of times, like say what happens to Korra a lot of the time. She'll walk into a room and all the politicians will come out and be like, and almost like manipulate kind of Korra into positions because they're more experienced in these situations. If Korra could just bring Azula out to be like, hey, give me an opening here. And Azula just like rips them apart with her words, put them in their place, and like turns it over to Korra in my example, but like Zuko in reality, she could really help Zuko in certain situations, with the idea being that he's this optimistic leader who he might not be able to get through to people a lot of the times based on the way the politics tend to go. Azula could be a very important character in that sort of like sense of just, do the tides command the ship type situation, or what she does to a Long Feng. But then she walks back over to her friends and is this really awkward character, and she doesn't know what to do. They're kind of like, giving out to her a little bit for like, you went a bit too far there, Azula. And what sort of an Azula who kind of actually like thinks about her actions is kind of like, maybe I did. And just the idea of like the different dynamics you could have with a more redeemed like Azula, that like people can make fun of her a little bit and it doesn't have to be a big issue situation. That like Mai, for example, feels like a character who in a redeemed Azula situation would be a little bit more open to just like criticizing Azula when needed, and that would be kind of interesting. Whatever that new dynamic for those three, it would be very, very interesting. But just the idea, she can turn this on when she has to, but she can turn it off and be like we're kind of discussing here, be more like this awkward character, take the armor off of the I'll always control people through fear, and what she is. And like we're talking about here, like Zuko in a lot of situations, like when he joins Team Avatar, is an awkward character. And I think the same is ultimately true for Azula. Probably even more so because Zuko, at least, he's a specific type of character and you get where that awkwardness comes from. Azula just feels like full on, like she doesn't know what to do a lot of the time. And so that would make it for a very different dynamic. And that's kind of fun to see that, kind of like in The Beach, where like Ty Lee stands out as this like character who like is just so much better than Azula in a lot of these situations. Even Mai is better than Azula in so many situations in The Beach. And just creating more situations where just like it's Azula out of her depth, but you're not relying on the other kind of like aspect type thing. And that's the kind of like interesting point that you might be able to get. And especially like people are pointing out that everything's intense in the show. In a much more relaxed situation, that's an interesting position to put the likes of an Azula in, to see how that all goes. Because like I pointed out earlier, you showed this little dynamic with Ty Lee. She's jealous of this fact. And the fact that she kind of wants to learn about that is a glimmer of hope. That she actually tries in this scene to be a little bit more normal. Even the fact that she's sort of interested in having some sort of a relationship or romance, that's good. She's not like this character who doesn't know anything except control through fear. That there's glimmers still left there that are quite good, and that's a key, and it depends on how we get there. And it's all about the balance, because I get it. I really do get it. I don't want like a completely like declawed Azula, like kind of like the Irony Has thing, Canadian Azula. We don't quite want that, but I don't think you want to just forever rely on that Azula is always that, and she can only be that. Let's see, what's it? Ty Azula. If they want to go for it, fair enough. It's not one I immediately lean towards in terms of like I think there is setup already in the show or anything like that. If they do it well, I guess theoretically. But right now, as like, do I view this as being a potential canon ship? Not really. That's my kind of opinion on that. I don't quite see it. I understand it is a somewhat popular ship within the fandom. But I also like the kind of sort of friendship dynamic there, which is sort of that Ty Lee like super looks up to Azula as being this like incredibly like confident character, but then the reverse is kind of also true, that like Azula looks at Ty Lee as sort of the normal person that she kind of wishes she had aspects of, and there's some interesting ideas there that are kind of interesting. Like you'd have to do a lot of work to make a romantic thing with Ty Lee work, I think, with where you are. Because first of all, before you get there, you have to, I think, in some way fix the kind of friendship dynamic with these three. And I think there's a long way to go to do that as well. Now, to be fair, like I said earlier, I think the Ty Lee friendship is probably one of the ones more likely to maybe work for Azula first. May might take a little bit longer because she was the first one to sort of like break away. But that's the whole kind of like point, I think, in all of this, is that Azula has to, like Kuvira, Azula has to show the people around her that she has changed, is willing to change, is willing to work and try, and convince them that she has, changed for the better. Like, you have to show that arc to fix this. Which is why I think, these are maybe more likely to happen first, and so on. Now, this is an interesting one. Like, I don't think most people ever really talk about this dynamic. What do they do with the kind of new father figure, potentially, in Azula's life? Because this will be a very interesting one where, like, I don't think he would be against trying to have some sort of a relationship with Azula. And she also, I suppose, doesn't know, because she doesn't have the father-like relationship with Iroh. So she kind of is in need of an actual kind of like father figure, I think, in her life. And this would be cool if they maybe gave this a little bit of focus. Like, that would be a kind of interesting dynamic if, like, it takes time with Ursa, but what if for some reason Nora and Ikem just like connects with Azula, and that's a key dynamic, that it's maybe these two that make the breakthrough with Azula, which helps these two, which gets us to these two. Like, there's interesting ways to do this. Now, there's also the potential that certain characters just, what if they never make amends with Azula? That's also a possibility. Because you'll note I don't have like Team Avatar here, just because I feel like you really want to avoid the Azula becomes part of Team Avatar dynamic at all costs. I think you do not want to do that, because you do want to avoid it being too similar to a Zuko redemption arc. Now, she should probably apologize to say, like, Aang for killing him, but based on the search, Aang seems pretty okay with the idea, and is a character who's, I think, is sympathetic towards, like, Azula is a character who needs help to grow and change. So there's that. That's an interesting one. Like, Katara, I guess, has a weird dynamic because she saw Azula kill Aang, and she knows that happened. But Katara also was directly there to witness, this, and you saw her reaction to that, which wasn't to look at this Azula at the end with hatred necessarily. You have Sokka, who I think mostly just has relatively like neutral views on Azula, because like they're fighting like a lot of the time in the background in parts of the search. Like people often forget this as just a notable point, but that like Sokka holds off like Azula on like the roof of the house for like quite a large part of the search, and he's a non-bender, so it's pretty respectable performance from Sokka there. But you know, apart from, I suppose, he sort of helps Zuko to try to be a better big brother to Azula, we don't get too much of what his dynamic is. Like Toph Azula, outside of like the show, you don't really get much on what their opinions on each other are. You know, if you brought Suki into play, that's an interesting dynamic, because of their encounter, of course, off screen. So that's the thing. I don't necessarily think we're going to lean into the direction of like Azula becoming friends, super close friends with the rest of the group. As an Azula redemption, I think firmly places Azula in a better position with her family and like Mai and Ty Lee, the two obvious friends of the character, and I think that's probably the best we can potentially hope for ultimately with some of this stuff. Because like Zuko wants to try, you can see here, this is Zuko fully accepting his destiny, which is interesting given that Azula then goes on to consider what her destiny is. And he doesn't want things to be like this necessarily. And that's notable. And like obviously she runs off like the whole, even when you're strong, you're weak. And there's her skewed view on what things are. So that's what's interesting to me about like the whole Azula redemption thing, is like what characters will they involve in this? And obviously the idea is that ultimately this comic is going to be very, I think, internal for Azula, where I think we'll be lucky to even get like a little bit of like other Fire Warrior dialogue. Like the monk is going to be this newly introduced character. Otherwise, everything will be a reflection on the past and how Azula is viewing what she is shown. So this is not, it's not going to, I suppose, advance the Ursa dynamic unless a lot of what she is shown relates to Ursa and we really see the reactions to a lot of that sort of stuff. Now, maybe that's one way to do it. Maybe they can reflect on the past by like effectively showing, here's kind of like how you treated and talked about your mother. Here's how you've treated your brother. Here's how you treated your friends. You kidnapped your new sister, and stuff like this. You tried to kill your uncle, that sort of thing. And then maybe, what if she's shown that like, Ozai, you don't seem to care about him anymore, but he really was not helping you. That's where the other characters I think will get involved in maybe the new comic, is just scenes from the past that she is shown and stuff like that. I hope to do well with this comic. I was a little let down with Patterns in Time. I just wish they could be longer like the main ones. Yeah, like this is one of the ones where you feel like, yeah, you kind of want a 3-part Azula comic, but you get that it's going to be this interesting, specific transition arc. And you'd worry if they devoted 3 parts to it that that's a lot of books to devote to, we can't tell the full story in this comic. But it needs time, and it gets a bit awkward about like how far should they go, how far should they not go. That's interesting. The gang shouldn't be treated as a solid block. They could each have different opinions and relationships with Azula if they choose to do that. And yeah, like that is the point in all of this, is that like even as we see as I kind of went through, it's the idea that like Aang seems okay. He doesn't seem to hold grudges. He's okay. Is he going to be super close with Azula? I don't know, but he could help with the relationship. Katara is in a weird spot where half and half. Like, she has reasons to dislike Azula, reasons to be like, oh, I see some flaws here. Maybe Sokka could have like a weird connection with her. That could be something of interest. Toph, like it would be interesting if they just decided on a bit of a thing. Like, Azula and Toph have not really interacted that much. What if, as part of this redemption, Toph just develops some sort of an interesting dynamic with Azula? Like, that would be weird, but they could do it if they wanted to. So that's a kind of fun kind of potential idea. Let's see. Off topic. Do we have any updates about the books? Sequel to Yang Chen. Yang Chen Book 2 is a confirmed book. FC Yi, in an interview when the first book came out, mentioned like, you'll see this place in the second book. Beyond that one mention, we know very little about Yang Chen Book 2. Like, it hasn't been listed as a product yet, but we're expecting it, I think, this year, if the schedule for the Kyoshi books holds, in that a year after the first book. If that is the case, we would probably expect the announcement for that either maybe towards the end of this month or next month, because I think in the Kyoshi books case, Yang Chen Book 1 was announced in like March, so we might expect a March announcement again, but we'll see. We'll see. We all hope and want it to be this year, but we don't actually fully know for sure. So is that... Yeah, like the Toph potential, I think, is interesting. If like she's just around the group and kind of realizes that like, hey, all of you are a bit too like goody, but Toph has something to her. Like, you know, she speaks her mind or something like that. Like that's kind of a bit of an interesting thing. She might like, yeah, gravitate to that. Like maybe not the best character to judge like your new social behavior with other characters on Toph, but it'd be weird if like Azula gravitated in that way of like, so this is how you're meant to interact with people. You earthbend them while they're asleep. How do you feel about Azula running into Lao Ge as the monk character, or is he book only? Like, I assume the character Lao Ge is open to be used anywhere. Because if the character is immortal and has survived all this time, it is theoretically possible he's the guy in the temple. The problem, and I think I roughly mentioned this earlier on, is just that this is the case where you don't want to be like overly like fan servicey and just do the hardcore references just for the sake of the references, in that, okay, Lao Ge is a guru type character who fits this role, but it doesn't have to be him. Like, is Azula gonna learn about immortality? Is the philosophy of Lao Ge something that's like important to Azula's arc? Does it fit in that way? I'm not overly sure. In the same way that, like, could it be Guru Patik? I don't think so, because Guru Patik is the chakra guy. And I don't think Azula would sit there and patiently unlock all of her chakras and drink onion and banana juice and do what Aang did with him. So I do think it will be a new character. Or, as I said before, it will be some sort of a spirit maybe acting like a human or something like that. And because the implication from the description is, again, where are the words here? Is it something more mysterious? So they're implying already something up at the monk or the temple. It seems like a place to safely pass the night, but it's horrifyingly different. She's forced to confront her past. That doesn't sound like the actions of like a kind monk like a Guru Patik. Lao Ge also doesn't typically force people to do things based on the way we've seen him act in terms of like helping a character like a Kyoshi. The monk is the dojo master. Yeah. That's what they're going to do here. Yeah, the dojo master debut in the video game, but the true debut is in this comic. The reveal of the dojo master. Maybe, but probably not. Probably not. Is there anyone else it could be? I don't know, named character, because you hope that there's someone significant that fits, and you don't want it to just be, and then this character meets this guy. I think what they'll do is with Lao Ge is that he probably will appear in another book. They will keep him novel focused and maybe find a place for him somewhere else. But I like the idea of like he's more focused on the novels, and depending on what avatar we go to, he's surprisingly involved. So that's all very, very interesting. Anything else to talk about? Yeah. That's probably the core of it. You know. Like, that's the arc that you ultimately need. Like when you get to the emotional kind of heart of it, we are kind of looking for basically just some big emotional Azula scenes that prompt a change in the character. That's what we kind of want, is that like I mentioned earlier on, is like regards to, where's the sympathy section here, that yeah, she is also sort of to some degree, a victim of Ozai, like Zuko was, and in some ways worse, because she was right there the entire time. Everything he tried to do was directed completely at her. You have to be sympathetic towards her and want her to kind of move on from like basically being like raised as a weapon effectively. And that's why this happens, is because when the weapon fails to kind of function properly, it doesn't know how to handle it, and that's what happened here. And it's that's the kind of core of this, is that I get it, people like to view Azula as this like incredibly like strong character because she can be so commanding and amazing in some of those big scenes, like the did the tides command this ship scene, like the verbal takedown of Long Fang, and how she handled herself during like the invasion, wasting everyone's time. Those are fantastic moments, but it's like that is her with like full armor up, like not addressing any of the like issues. You're talking about the character who was in a mental institution for quite a while, between the end of the series and the end of the Promise going into the Search. The character who had like all of this stuff happen. Big reveals in the search that have like changed her perspectives on things. She's running away from like certain like emotional encounters, has this odd relationship with Zuko. There's a lot going on with the character, and so the want for her to just kind of figure some of this stuff out and come out of it like at least like a little bit better, I'm fine with that. And that's what I kind of want to happen. Let's see. Something kind of needs to happen to Azula where she's missing for a few years until the time skip. It really depends on how far they're going to go with the time skip. Because in the comics right now, like say Smoke and Shadow, and then, like, I suppose the thing with Azula at the Spirit Temple is like, it's set post Smoke and Shadow, but like, is this going to be like the furthest into the future of any of the comics? Is this going to be post Imbalance or just post Smoke and Shadow? Because there's a bit of a time skip between like North and South into Imbalance. That's like at least a couple of months. So Azula, I think at oldest here is going to be like 17. I'd be surprised if we're quite on the verge of her being 18. Maybe if we are post Imbalance, maybe you can just about get her to 18 if you really want to. And then okay, so role-playing game. Yeah, okay, so yeah, I guess that makes sense, yeah. Like, if she's continued her destabilizing campaign, they're saying that this campaign has been ongoing from Smoke and Shadow through Imbalance, and then this is Azula's story post-Imbalance. I think that probably has to be the way you take it, otherwise it's a bit overly kind of convoluted with the continuity. But there's that. And then if it's going to be sort of the characters as young adults, we assume that means like early 20s for the characters. Maybe some of the younger characters can still be like 18, 19. But it means that, like, what are we talking about here? From potentially the end of this comic into the start of the animated thing that covers Azula's story, we're talking about like what? A year, 2 years? I guess you're talking about at least maybe 2-3 years, maybe a little bit more, depending on how far we go. Is this live stream going to be posted after? Yeah, I'm pretty sure the way I have it set up is that the second I end the stream, it is just up as like a video. I think that's the way I always have it set up. Because, yeah, I always usually at least check to make sure that that's the case. So I think there's some processing stuff on YouTube's end that happens, but basically I'm pretty sure it'll be right there immediately. As far as I'm aware. Because I don't like take them down and do anything with them in between. Am I going to do another collection video? I get asked this a bit. My thing with collection videos is that I still have all the stuff from all my other collection videos. And the only new stuff in my collection is stuff I've reviewed since that video. So, and there's not a lot of extra stuff I get that I don't really like post about online. So, in my mind, it's a somewhat like boring video that like is a lot of time to pull stuff out of my collection and show it on video again. When it's just like, effectively, I have all the books that have come out since the most recent book I covered in my last video. I have a certain amount of the action figures and statues, merchandise that came out. And that's kind of really about it. Because, like, especially in the last year or two, merchandise has slowed down quite a bit. Like, there's not that much stuff coming out. Like, has anything new on the action figure front happened this year? I don't believe so. Or am I missing something? I don't think so. Like, I guess like what, Nendoroid Aang like recently came out, but we knew about that from the end of last year. So that's the main reason I don't necessarily like to do it, because it's like there's nothing super interesting to show off. Of course. Do you think they'll make a new 3-part comic series for Avatar? Not quite. Not now. I think they've moved away from that with Imbalance. They basically said as much. Maybe when we're much closer to the content, we'll see them do some sort of a series that is more of a direct sort of like, here's a first look or something like that at like, maybe here's the characters slightly older as like a teaser into the new content, and they let Dark Horse do that. It depends on like, do you want to highlight the movie as like the first time seeing the characters looking like this, or are you okay with other content doing it? I think for the most part we have to deal with the fact that the comics are one-shots for now. Livestream, but I gotta ask that since, of course, this comic won't probably have a redemption arc totally finished, and neither will it have more parts, but there's a chance that the future comics help to continue her redemption. This is the point here with this. As far as we're aware, they're listing this as like a standalone comic. They're barely even referring to it as like a one shot. I don't know if that necessarily means anything, but for sure they're calling it a standalone comic. If this creative team is doing another comic to follow this up, I'm assuming it will be about other characters. That this is the Azula comic for now. We have to see, of course, how they choose to end off Azula's story in this comic. It could end in a way that maybe prompts another comic to do like a little bit more, but it could also end in a way where it's like, and yet we're probably not really seeing Azula again until Avatar Studios Movie 1, Avatar Studios Movie 2. That's the kind of point here, is that I do think the comic is there to be a transition from her comic arc with the Fire Warriors and Smoke and Shadow into positioning Azula ahead of whatever they're going to do with her in one of the animated movies. Because that's, I think, the big takeaway from the comics. They don't want, I think, hugely important things happening in the comics anymore, because from an animated perspective, that's stuff they will have to potentially explain in the movies to people who are unaware. They already have quite a bit of that, in that, like, if you haven't read the comics and you go into, like, say, the first new movie and you're like, wait, where did Ursa come back from? Who's Kiyi? why does Zuko have another sister? And all these other things. You know, there's that sort of stuff. Yeah, a Mei Zuko standalone is needed. Yeah, that's the other aspect of Smoke and Shadow we need to follow up on, is definitely that relationship needs to probably get back together. Because I don't think, again, from a continuity perspective, you probably don't want to explain like, oh, they broke up and then they got back together in this. That's a bit awkward. Will 80 pages be enough? That's the big thing. That's going to be something that hovers over this book the entire time as we wait for it to kind of release, is, will it actually be enough? And we're not going to know. We're not going to know because of when it's coming out, because it's in September. What we're going to get preview pages, 2 months before release. So we're talking July, probably like mid to late July for preview pages for this book, like proper preview pages, not just the two kind of ones that we got here. The true preview pages for this book, where we maybe see 6, 7, 8 pages, we will probably have to wait until late July. If I get a review copy again, the earliest I would probably get that review copy again probably would be 2 months before release, but probably more than likely a month or a month and a half beforehand, if they approve me for a review copy, of course. But that's the important thing to realize here, is that I think this is the information on this comic. Everything that we have here, the description, these 2 initial preview pages, this is everything until probably July. And that's the thing here, is that I don't think there'll be too much to add on to this until that point. Because from a marketing perspective, like, unless they give us like early preview pages in like a big like article or something like that, that's just where we're at. Otherwise, we probably are waiting for what's the next Avatar comic, when are they going to announce the Mako comic, and other stuff like that. But it's exciting. It's nice to be excited about Azula. For this is the crazy thing with this. 7 years. When it comes out, it'll be 7 full years since the last time we advanced Azula's story. Like, it's crazy. Now, to be fair, this also means that, like, what, Mai and Zuko have been broken up for, like, what, 10 years at this point? They need to solve that as well. Like, there's a lot of things like this as well. So, that's the big thing. So, didn't even know there were comics 7 years ago. Well, that's the thing. What the promise started in, like, what, 2012 alongside Korra. That's the kind of era we're talking about here, because we're referencing a lot of that quite early stuff. So that's that. Sokka definitely needs a comic. We won't be waiting 7 years again, definitely. Like I said, we'll advance her story, we'll reposition her here, and then the 2025 Avatar movie, potentially called Echoes and Aftershocks, young adult Team Avatar, that one, Aang and Friends, that might be where we see Azula again. Or this rumored Zuko movie that is also meant to be the year 2 of Avatar Studios stuff, that might be where we see Azula. It probably won't be in a comic the time we see Azula after the Spirit Temple. It probably will be in an animated movie or something like that. Now, we don't know the full plans for the comics, but this is a one-shot. They've said it's a standalone comic. That's the big thing. So that's the important thing to note. So, I suppose we're getting to the point where we're going to wrap things up. So I suppose final questions here. I'll put out the call for some final questions before we wrap up the stream. I always plan these to be like, okay, I'll go about 2 hours. They always end up being like 3 hours. So won't make it too much longer. So yeah, we'll just do some final kind of like wrap up here. Again, my plan is that I usually will, for this year, I want to try and stream at least once a month. And I want to try and kind of keep to that. It will depend to some degree on if there's actually stuff to talk about, because I don't like to stretch and try and form topics just out of the blue to try and do a stream. I like it when stuff actually happens and it's like, yeah, I can talk about that for a really long time. Okay, how will Azula be power scaled in the new comic? I'd be kind of surprised if we see too much of like Azula in action outside of maybe flashback scenes. Like, who's she gonna be like fighting or attacking? Like, okay, like there's the potential for the monk to be some sort of a martial artist or a bender. There's the potential that some sort of spirit in there she ends up fighting. That's an option. From like the search, we know Azula can handle herself against at least like what, mid-level spirits or something like that. She's able to fend them off with like lightning and stuff like that. She's pretty much back to her best as of Smoke and Shadow, and I can't see her going backwards in this book. But if she's put off balance by like her emotions being shown her past, it could lead to her potentially being defeated, which is often the root of how she is defeated in other situations. Maybe Azula learned some lost firebending techniques. Well, she learned lightning redirection from just kind of watching Zuko, I guess. So there's the chance for her to do more as well. but that's really, all there is to say there. Um, duh, duh, duh. Anything else to mention here? So yeah, I think that probably is a decent stopping point for the stream. So yeah, Mako livestream. Whenever we get the announcement of like the book, I guess with like a description and stuff like that, I guess we can do a very similar thing for Mako, because one, I'm interested in it, but I think we also have to do a bit of the like Mako character breakdown here, because I think, as has been mentioned a few times in chat here, that's needed just as much. It's probably not the same level of depth as there is for Azula, but just from a, hey, a lot of people don't seem to know the character of Mako, and he's just a joke at this point to a lot of people. But what are they actually going to do? So I think that it's worth doing that, and we can do that whenever it does happen. But we're probably still a couple of months away from seeing that. In that, if we're getting this book announced for September here, it has to be the next 3 months or so, and hopefully we get that one. But yeah, look, I like Mako as a character. I definitely want to discuss him more. I have at least one video on the channel where I did a deep dive on Mako. I forget what I called it. I did a couple of them in a row where, like, I think I did one on the Red Lotus, one on Asami, one on Mako. It wasn't rewriting, it was it defending? No, I forget the exact word I used on those specific videos, but I think I was pretty happy with those ones. Was it like a where do we go with? I forget, but anyway, those videos on the channel. I have Mako videos on the channel. We'll do a stream when that happens. So there's that. But yeah, thanks to everyone for coming out to the stream to discuss Azula and the upcoming comic in detail. Again, stay tuned to the channel because any news about the comics, other little details that do come out about this, other comics and other stuff, I'll cover in videos. Like I said, I'll try and do another live stream next month. Hopefully something pops up. Doesn't seem like there's an investors event coming up, so I don't know if February will have anything. As ever, we remain waiting for news on Netflix Avatar. Whenever they decide to do that, maybe that will be the next thing. But maybe in the next month we'll have our first look at Netflix Avatar. Maybe that can be the stream topic if it happens. But yeah, thanks for coming out, everyone. That has been the stream. Thanks for watching, and bye.